In this video, we're going to talk about GoldenEye, the introduction of the Pierce Brosnan era of James Bond. This is a movie where Bond bungees off a huge dam, where he chases an airplane off a cliff, gets in, and flies away in it. The movie where he drives a tank through the streets of St. Petersburg, and the movie where he doesn't know if he's fighting the femme fatale or making love to her. This is a movie where Pierce Brosnan finally gets to don the mantle of 007, and he's fantastic. And this is the moment where fans consider James Bond to have entered the modern age. If Sean Connery and George Lazenby represent the golden age of 007 in the 60s, then Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton represent Bond in the silver age of the 1970s and 1980s. And Pierce Brosnan and Daniel Craig represent Bond in modern times. So immediately after License to Kill, Eon and MGM UA began pre-production on the 17th Bond film and their third Timothy Dalton 007 movie. However, MGM wanted to take James Bond into the modern era, and they worried that screenwriter Richard Maibaum and director John Glenn were too stuck in the past. And that's a crazy bold statement, but also a little hard to argue against. Richard Maibaum was there from the beginning and had written 12 screenplays for James Bond, including Dr. No, For Much With Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Man with the Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Me, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and had even started work on License to Kill. And John Glenn was instrumental in defining James Bond for the 1980s and brought Generation X to the Bond franchise. John Glenn had started as an editor and second unit director for On Her Majesty's Secret Service and had directed For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill. But MGM really wanted to go in a new direction for the Bond franchise and try to appeal to a whole new, younger demographic. Shortly thereafter, Richard Maibaum in 1991 passed away at the age of 81, and as for John Glenn, he would go on to direct the 1992 film Christopher Columbus, The Discovery, the one without Gerard Depardieu. But what did it mean for MGM to go into the modern era and appeal to a younger demographic? Well, it turned out that a survey that MGM did discovered that most teenagers in 1990 did not know who James Bond was, and those that knew associated with him as a character that their fathers liked. The younger generation preferred action movies like Die Hard, Commando, Terminator, Batman, or Indiana Jones, not the James Bond movies, and MGM wanted to change that and bring James Bond to appeal to that new, younger audience. So screenwriters William Osborne and William Davies, the two had written Stop or My Mom Will Shoot for Sylvester Stallone and Twins for Arnold Schwarzenegger, they wrote a story about Bond going up against a Hong Kong industrialist named Sir Henry Ferguson, who teams up with a Chinese general to take over mainland China and Hong Kong. And this movie would have had Bond going to Vancouver, then Las Vegas, then Hong Kong and China. Cubby Broccoli began pre-production on the third Timothy Dalton James Bond film, and they were in search of a director, and one of the directors they were looking at was John Landis. John Landis was primarily known as a comedic director, directing Animal House, Blues Brothers, Trading Places, Coming to America, but showed his versatility in directing An American Werewolf in London. And then some legal drama occurred. In 1991, an Australian financing company known as Quintex was trying to purchase MGM UA for the price of $1.5 billion. However, at the last minute, Quintex could not raise the money and the purchase fell through. But MGM UA was vulnerable, and then suddenly an Italian financing company called Pathé, owned by Giancarlo Peretti, jumped in and tried a hostile takeover of MGM UA for the price of $1.2 billion. And there were rumors that Giancarlo Peretti was somewhat of a shady businessman. Peretti had just taken over Cannon Films, yes, the Cannon Films, who had made Bloodsport, Break-In and Break-In 2 Electric Boogaloo, Masters of the Universe, and Superman 4 Quest for Peace. Peretti took over Cannon from Menachem Golem and Yoram Globus and changed the name of Cannon Films to Pathé Communications. And he wanted to take over MGM UA. Apparently, Peretti was allegedly known for bank fraud and writing bad checks in Europe, although I can't verify this, but some online news sites accuse him of this. Well, Giancarlo Peretti did not have $1.2 billion, but he had a very shady plan to come up with the money for the merger. And his plan was that even before owning MGM UA, he began to go to various broadcasting companies and sell off the broadcasting rights to the MGM UA library. And with that money, he used it to make a down payment on the $1.2 billion. And it sounds blatantly corrupt to me, but that's exactly what he did. And Peretti's ultimate goal may have been to fully acquire the MGM UA library, which was worth far more than $1.2 billion, and sell them off piece by piece and making a hefty profit. And one of the deals that Peretti made was to Ted Turner, who began running James Bond films on his TNT network without permission from Eon Films. Peretti did not quite own MGM yet, so he really didn't have the right to be doing this. And even if he did, Cubby Broccoli owned half the James Bond franchise, and Peretti didn't consult nor pay Broccoli to do this. One day, Cubby Broccoli is watching TV and he sees that Ted Turner is airing his James Bond movies. And through this shady trick, he was briefly able to take over and own MGM, which he renamed MGM Pathé. And Peretti would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for that pesky Cubby Broccoli. Cubby Broccoli sued Peretti and stopped the merger. Giancarlo Peretti countersued, and it was an ugly court battle that was able to tie up this merger in courts long enough that the suit eventually joined by Blake Edwards. And this is also because the two major MGM UA films that were being aired were the James Bond films and the Pink Panther movies. And Blake Edwards had created the Pink Panther. The combined lawsuits was able to tie up the merger in court. And in 1993, Peretti went bankrupt. And then a French bank, Credit Lyonnais, acquired MGM Pathé Communications and renamed the company back to MGM. And with Cubby Broccoli, began production on the next James Bond movie. Incidentally, in 1999, Giancarlo Peretti was found guilty of misuse of corporate funds and fraud and was sentenced to 4 years in prison by a Paris court. Cubby Broccoli went to Timothy Dalton for Bond 17, and Timothy Dalton was interested in the role. However, his original 3-picture contract had just expired, so Cubby Broccoli said that since there was a long gap since the last movie, they would have to make a few more movies to reestablish Dalton as Bond, and insisted that Timothy Dalton sign another 5-year, maybe possibly a 3 to 4 film contract, and Timothy Dalton was not interested in playing Bond for that long. In other words, it was possibly a dance of negotiations. Well, that dance fell through, and Timothy Dalton walked away from the role. However, in a 2015 interview with Alan Ladd Jr., he said that in reality, MGM wanted to get rid of Timothy Dalton and go in a new direction, but Eon really liked him, and they let him have the story that he walked away so that he can save face and still salvage his movie career. Timothy Dalton was on the set of the TV movie Scarlet, where he was starring as Rhett Butler on the sequel to Gone with the Wind, and on April 11, 1994, he officially announced that he was resigning from the role of James Bond. For the screenwriter of Bond 17, Michael France, who had written Cy Salone's Cliffhanger, wrote a draft of the script that would address the relevancy of Bond in the post-Cold War age. In Michael France's script, he created a character named Augustus Trevelyan, who was James Bond's mentor and superior at MI6, who defected to the Soviet Union. And the film involved a satellite that delivered a powerful electromagnetic pulse, and there was a scene where Bond, in his Aston Martin, would drive the car inside a high-speed train. Then another screenwriter, Jeffrey Kane, revised Michael France's script and tightened up the narrative and structure of the story. And he made Augustus Trevelyan a fellow 00 agent of Bond, who Bond thought was dead, but was in hiding as a Russian gangster. Bruce Fierstein came in and made final revisions to the script. And Fierstein was a famous comedic writer who in 1981 had written the immensely popular satirical book Real Men Don't Eat Quiche, which had spent over 55 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and penetrated the zeitgeist of the nation at the time. And those from my generation likely remember this book. And for those that actually read it, the entire first chapter is about how every man desires to be James Bond. And no doubt this is what attracted Eon to hire Bruce Fierstein. For the director, they offered the film to Hong Kong action star John Woo, who turned it down to make Broken Arrow, but was very honored by the offer. And the very next year, he would go on to make Face Off. They also offered it to Rennie Harlan, who had just made Die Hard 2, but he turned it down so that he could make Cutthroat Island with his then-wife, Gina Davis, the one that would bankrupt their studio. So the job went to New Zealand director Martin Campbell, who was primarily a television director at the time, and he did a few B-list movies, but this was going to be his first major Hollywood motion picture, and he'll be the first non-Brit to direct a James Bond film in the history of the 007 franchise. And from here, he's going to become a superstar director. Next, he'll direct the 1998 film Mask of Zorro, and in 2005, The Legend of Zorro, and in 2006 he'll direct the amazing Daniel Craig debut, Casino Royale. Incidentally, he'll also go on to direct Green Lantern with Ryan Reynolds, but I'll try not to hold that against him. One of the things that Martin Campbell added to his James Bond story was that James Bond never smokes. Remember, Sean Connery's Bond smoked cigarettes, but Roger Moore's Bond was made to smoke cigars to differentiate himself from Sean Connery's Bond, although they did eventually drop that trait. However, Timothy Dalton's Bond also smoked cigarettes in order to resemble the Bond of the novels. However, Martin Campbell hated smoking and made Bond completely smokeless. Now, at this time when Eon was casting for a new James Bond, I'm sure everyone assumed that Pierce Brosnan would be the next Bond. But Ray Fiennes, Liam Neeson, and Hugh Grant, as well as several others, were considered before the role officially was given to Pierce Brosnan.
You were expecting someone else?
We all know that Pierce Brosnan was offered the role in 1987, and back then he was a relative unknown, having just starred in one TV series, Remington Steele. Well, now he was a veteran movie star, having starred in a dozen major motion pictures, including The Fourth Protocol and the miniseries James Clavell's Noble House. He also starred in the cult classic The Lawnmower Man and the widely successful Robin Williams vehicle, Mrs. Doubtfire. So in 1994, he was a bona fide movie star. Pierce Brosnan was born on May 16, 1953 in Drogheda, Ireland, and when he was a baby, his father left the mother, so his mother had to move to England to work as a nurse. And so Pierce was raised by his grandparents. And when he was 11, he moved to Scotland to join his mother and her new husband, who introduced Pierce Brosnan to the James Bond movies. And Pierce Brosnan became a huge fan of James Bond. They soon moved to London, and Pierce attended the St. Martin's School of Art in London to become a painter and commercial illustrator. But while in school, he found acting, and he decided to become an actor. He joined the Drama Centre of London, and afterwards had bit parts in several TV shows. And in 1981, Pierce Brosnan was married to Cassandra Harris, who played Countess Liesel in For Your Eyes Only. And Cassandra Harris wanted her husband to play James Bond and brought him to the set. And while Brosnan visited her, Cubby Broccoli met with him and was fascinated with him and took Pierce and Cassandra Harris out to lunch. And after the meal, he is said to have said, "If he can act, he's my Bond." Sadly, Cassandra Harris passed away from cancer in 1991, and Pierce Brosnan stayed at her side the entire time and even adopted her children from a previous marriage. So he is a total class act. Pierce Brosnan was then hired for the role of Remington Steele, which ran for 4 seasons, and in 1986, when they were casting for The Living Daylights, Cubby Broccoli wanted Timothy Dalton, but he was busy filming Brenda Starr. So they auditioned many actors, and Pierce Brosnan, who was a diehard James Bond fan, was perfect, and he was cast in the role of James Bond. Now, Remington Steele had just been canceled, although they had 60 days to pick up the show. And Eon announced that Pierce Brosnan was cast as James Bond. They did costume fittings, promotional stills, and press releases. And unfortunately, this announcement as James Bond caused a lot of fans to go back and watch reruns of Remington Steele. And this new interest in Remington Steele caused NBC to renew Remington Steele for another season. But Cubby Broccoli really wanted Pierce Brosnan to be Bond, so he negotiated a deal where Brosnan could be in 6 episodes of Remington Steele and still be in the Bond movie, but NBC got greedy and insisted on a full 22-episode season. And this caused Pierce Brosnan to lose out on the role of James Bond, with Cubby Broccoli saying, "Remington Steele will not be James Bond, and James Bond will not be Remington Steele." Sadly, with Pierce Brosnan no longer being James Bond, interest in Remington Steele dropped. The series was canceled forever without shooting any episodes, and so Pierce Brosnan lost out on both James Bond and Remington Steele. One of the fans of James Bond who was devastated that Pierce Brosnan didn't get the role of Bond in 1987 was director Chris Columbus. He thought Pierce Brosnan would have made the perfect Bond, so in 1991 when he was casting for the role of Stu in Mrs. Doubtfire, he cast Pierce Brosnan for the role. And on set, Chris Columbus told Pierce Brosnan what a great Bond he would have made and recommend that he never give up on trying. And in 1995, MGM actually called Chris Columbus and informed him that they were considering hiring Pierce Brosnan for the role of James Bond and called to ask what it was like working with him. And Chris Columbus gave a strong, glowing recommendation and told MGM what a nice guy he was and how professional and easy to work with Pierce Brosnan was on the set. So Pierce Brosnan was cast and he was paid a salary of $4 million. And he would go on to make a total of $41 million for all 4 of his James Bond films. So that's not bad. The title of the movie was announced as GoldenEye, And this is the first James Bond movie not based on an Ian Fleming story. And this is the second film after License to Kill that is not named after an Ian Fleming novel title. Now, GoldenEye is named after Ian Fleming's beach house in Jamaica, where he wrote all of the Bond novels from 1952 to 1964. The phrase GoldenEye is apparently a reference to a British Secret Service operation that Ian Fleming himself was a part of during World War II, where he served as military intelligence officer, and it was actually the contingency plan that the SIS had in case the Nazis invaded Spain. This movie will be the final James Bond film that Albert Cubby Broccoli saw, and I imagine that he must have been very happy that his franchise was in good hands. This will also be the first film where his daughter, Barbara Broccoli, will come on as full producer along with her half-brother Michael G. Wilson, who had produced and co-written every James Bond movie since The Spy Who Loved Me. For the role of 006, originally this part was going to go to an older actor who was supposed to be more of a mentor than a contemporary, and you can see the true subtext then, and they wanted Anthony Hopkins to play Alex Trevelyan, but he declined. Incidentally, Anthony Hopkins would go on to play the older Zorro in director Martin Campbell's next movie, the older Zorro who mentors the younger new Zorro, so you can see the connection there. Sean Bean, who had auditioned for the role of James Bond in The Living Daylights, was cast in the role. For the role of Xenia Onatopp, the producers originally wanted Courtney Cox, and I cannot see that at all. However, she turned it down to star in this new sitcom called Friends. Famke Janssen was hired for Onatopp when Martin Campbell saw her in the early dailies of the 1995 film Lord of Illusions. And Famke Janssen is Dutch and attended the University of Amsterdam and majored in economics, and then enrolled in Columbia University and studied literature. And at age 20, she became a model and worked for Yves Saint Laurent, Giorgio Armani, Chanel, and Victoria's Secret, and at 26 entered acting. And one of her first roles was in the 5th season of Star Trek The Next Generation, the episode The Perfect Mate. And later that year, she was offered the role of Jadzia Dax in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but declined it in order to pursue a movie career. For the role of computer nerd Natalya Simonova, the filmmakers wanted Paulina Porskova, who was an incredibly popular supermodel in the 1980s. However, Paulina declined, and the role eventually went to Izabella Scorupco. And Izabella Scorupco was born in Poland, but grew up in Stockholm, Sweden. And she traveled through Europe working as a model, and in 1987 starred in her first Swedish film, Nobody Can Love Like Us. And in 1990 had a brief career as a pop singer, and her first album was certified gold in Sweden. GoldenEye was to be her big break in American films, but that didn't exactly happen, but she continues to act in many Swedish films. For the role of M, the producers wanted to do something different, like make M a woman. And when MGM heard that Ian was looking for a female to be cast as M, the studio's heads of MGM called and said, "You better hire Judi Dench." And so Martin Campbell called Judi Dench and made her an offer. And she was hesitant at first, but her entire family, including her husband, insisted she take the role. And her husband even joked that he always wanted to be married to a Bond girl. Barbara Broccoli, Michael G. Wilson, and Martin Campbell wanted to do something very special for the opening of the movie. Something that would set the tone for the new modern direction of not only this movie, but the entire franchise. Something that would razzle-dazzle the new younger generation. And that was the bungee jump. And this bungee jump was filmed at the Contra Dam in Ticino, Switzerland. And this stunt was done by stuntman Wayne Michaels, who was a minor stuntman on the Eon team and did background stunts in For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, and The Living Daylights. But this will be his first big stunt for the James Bond movies. And the jump would be 722 feet, which was the highest anyone had ever bungee jumped before. And the stunt took 2 weeks to prepare for, and even though the preparations didn't exactly go as planned, stuntman Wayne Michaels decided to go for it anyway. However, Michaels was worried that the drop would cause him to pass out at the end. However, he knew that during the jump, he had to pull out a grappling gun for the shot. And this involved taking the gun out of its holster while he was plummeting 720 feet toward the ground. So Wayne Michaels focused all of his attention and effort on taking out the gun of the holster and aiming it. And sure enough, he completed the shot successfully. And also sure enough, he did pass out at the end of the jump. However, they got the shot in one take. And Wayne Michaels was uninjured, and it would go on to be the stunt that opened up and defined the Brosnan era of Bond. Now, some sources claim that they actually did 2 jumps, but in interviews with the cast and crew, they claimed that it was only 1 jump. Now, the largest stunt sequence in the film was the tank chase through the streets of St. Petersburg, and this sequence took around 6 weeks to film. Originally, they actually considered filming this in St. Petersburg, but the Russian government made too many demands on the Eon crew. Therefore, the production crew actually built a replica of St. Petersburg on the back lot of Leavesden Studios in Hertfordshire. Interestingly, they couldn't film at Pinewood Studios, their own 007 Cubby Broccoli studio, because it was fully booked at the time filming the 1995 film First Night, starring Sean Connery as King Arthur. The crew spent $1 million to build a replica of St. Petersburg that the tank could plow through and destroy. And for the tank itself, a Russian T-55 tank was on loan from the East England Military Museum. And filming the sequence in England ultimately ended up saving the crew much time, money, and a lot of headaches. However, for the long shot of the tank in St. Petersburg, a small second unit team went to St. Petersburg to drive the tank slowly and carefully around the city. In fact, they were so concerned of any damages to the city that the crew even replaced the tank treads of the Russian T-55 with British tank treads, which did not leave tread marks on the streets of St. Petersburg. When the two scenes were merged together, it really looked like a tank was wreaking havoc through the streets of St. Petersburg. In fact, when the movie premiered in Russia, many citizens were outraged and filed complaints with their local government that a tank was allowed to rampage through their city. And the Russians were shocked to discover that most of it was filmed on a studio back lot in England. One of the many ways that the crew were able to save money on the special effects was that they used a ton of miniature models created by Eon regular Derek Meddings. In fact, GoldenEye had more miniature models than any of the previous James Bond films. Among the miniatures used in this movie was most of the external shots of Severnaya base in Siberia, the scene where the 3 MiGs approach Severnaya and are destroyed. Yeah, that was all miniatures. The scene where the Bond's tank crashes into Janos's train, miniatures, and the round lake which hides the satellite dish. That was also a miniature, and the satellite dish at the finale of the movie. These were all miniatures, and I had no idea they were miniatures, and even when I watch the movie now knowing that they're miniatures, I have a hard time believing it because they look so good. And Derek Meddings began his career working for Jerry Anderson, including the Thunderbird series. He then started working for Cubby Broccoli when he made some miniatures for Live and Let Die, and he was rehired for The Man with the Golden Gun, and then returned for The Spy Who Loved Me, and he created the Lotus that turns into a submarine, and then created the miniatures for the supertanker and the nuclear submarine. And then he created most of the optical effects for Moonraker, convincing the world that James Bond really did go to space. Derek Meddings also worked on the Superman series and created the Krypton miniatures as well as the Golden Gate Bridge. But sadly, GoldenEye will be his last film because he died in 1995 from colorectal cancer at the age of 64. And like all Bond movies, this film starts with a gun barrel sequence, but this time the gun barrel sequence was made with CGI, which as you see allowed for a more realistic texture change inside the gun barrel. And the movie's going to start with an incredible stunt, but the first shot is an airplane, which will pay off later in the sequence. So the film opens up with a huge dam, and we see a man in a black outfit running to the center of the dam, and we don't see his face yet, but at the bottom of the dam, we see a point where he's going to land, and then the camera pans up, and it pans up, and the camera just keeps panning up, and we realize that Bond is going to bungee down this insane height. Pause for a moment, and then he dives, and it's a great first shot. And the actual jump, 722 feet, set the Guinness Book of World's Record for the highest bungee jump ever. And mid-jump, he calmly pulls out his gun and harpoon guns the bottom of the dam, and you have to give credit to stuntman Wayne Michaels for his composure in pulling out the gun during this crazy drop. It's a spectacular start of the movie. And he's going to get an upgrade here as not only the main stuntman, as well as a nice upgrade where he has a minor speaking role playing Captain Bernard Jobert, the French Tiger helicopter pilot, the one who gets killed by Xenia Onatopp. Then Bond rappels down into the bathroom, and hanging upside down, we sort of get a tease of his first appearance. But then we get the full view. Pierce Brosnan holding a gun in that classic Bond pose, and he looks great. He looks better than Timothy Dalton, looks better than Roger Moore, and based on his looks, I would say he looks better than Sean Connery. He's insanely handsome, and he's clearly the best looking Bond yet. But can he deliver the goods in his acting? So he runs into 006, Sean Bean, who is now known as Ned Stark. Before that, he was Boromir, and here he plays Bond's predecessor and mentor, Alex Trevelyan. And you see the symbolism. New Bond versus Old Bond. And Sean Bean with his lighter colored hair has a passing resemblance to Roger Moore, and he even says the classic line associated with Roger Moore,
"For England."
But James, I need you.
So does England.
So we get the metatextual reference of Old Bond mentoring New Bond. 006 and 007 set up explosives to destroy the hideout inside the dam. And I love the way Pierce Brosnan moves here. He's got confidence, he's got swagger, but he also has a cold ruthlessness as well as lightning swift athleticism that's been missing in all the previous James Bond films. In fact, Pierce Brosnan did many of the stunts himself and almost did all of the fight scenes himself, and it shows in this more convincing performance. 006 is captured by the commanding officer of the facility, Colonel Arkady Grigorovich Orumov, and Orumov shoots and kills him, or so we think. The Soviet soldiers are circling Bond and he hides behind this explosive gas canister, and the Russians can't shoot because if they do, they're going to blow up everyone in the room. And if there's the old classic Bond, we might have gotten a James Bond one-liner, but I like that this modern Bond has more modern writing, because instead of a one-liner, we get the wheels that are squeaking. And it's funny, and there's humor, but the humor is more subtle. And when one of the soldiers nervously fires at Bond, risking an explosion, Colonel Orumov shoots him. And this was inspired by the 1969 Western film, The Wild Bunch. Bond then shoots a latch out the gas canisters, and it's a visually amazing scene where it rains gas canisters on the Russian troops. And Bond makes his escape and goes outside, where he catches up to an airplane about to take off. However, both he and the pilot fall out of the plane, and as the plane goes off a cliff, Bond jumps on a motorcycle and rides off the cliff after the airplane, catches up to the falling plane, gets in, and pilots away safely using the plane as the explosives destroy the base. It's a crazy opening sequence, and it tells you exactly what kind of movie you're in and what kind of movies we're going to get with the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films. And I am totally on board. And then we get this movie's opening montage. And this was the first montage that was not done by Maurice Binder, who had created all the musical montages since Dr. No. In fact, Maurice Binder actually came up with the gun barrel sequence. Maurice Binder, after 16 films, passed away in 1991 from lung cancer at the age of 65. GoldenEye's opening montage was created by Daniel Kleinman, and this opening montage actually tells a story. The pre-credit action sequence supposedly takes place 9 years earlier when the Soviet Union was at its peak, and the movie proper starts after the fall of the Soviet Union, so the music montage fills in the gaps and tells us about the fall of the Soviet Union. And for the song GoldenEye, it was written by Bono and The Edge, aka David Howell Evans, and the song was performed by Tina Turner. However, because Bono wrote the song independently of the producers, the lyrics to the song have nothing to do with the movie. And furthermore, because the producers didn't collaborate with Bono or The Edge, the musical melody of the song is never used throughout the movie, as was a custom for James Bond musical songs. However, it's a great song and is considered a fan favorite. Now keep in mind, this movie was originally written for Timothy Dalton, but I feel it's already a different movie because Brosnan just oozes swagger, and he has a smirk on his face that says, "I'm having a great time." And Pierce Brosnan has the confidence of Sean Connery, he has the suave sophistication of Roger Moore, and yet has the cold dark edge of Timothy Dalton. I think Pierce Brosnan is a great James Bond. However, 007 fans may argue that he had the disadvantage of being in some of the weaker films of the franchise. We start the movie proper 9 years later after the pre-credit sequence, and James Bond is driving the classic Aston Martin DB5, and he's riding with a woman who is evaluating him. And I like that this movie starts with the Aston Martin because it's not the car we're going to associate with the Pierce Brosnan Bonds. Sean Connery drove the Aston Martin, Roger Moore drove the Lotus Esprit, and Pierce Brosnan will become associated with the BMW. And then he comes across a red Ferrari F355 driven by the movie's Femme Fatale, played by Famke Janssen, who is probably best known for a role here and for playing Jean Grey in the X-Men movie series. And she is great because she's so beautiful and sexy, but there's this aura of danger all about her. And the two race on this narrow snake-like road playing chicken while Bond's evaluator is freaking out. And Bond is just having a great time. And this scene was filmed by Remy Julien, whose precision stunt team did the car stunts for A View to a Kill and did the final semi-truck scene in License to Kill. And while filming this scene, there was one slip-up where two cars actually crashed into each other, The Ferrari F355 was rented and the crew had to fix the Ferrari overnight at a cost of $80,000. We get a cameo here by director Martin Campbell, and Ferrari allowed the use of their car to be used in this movie on the condition that it would not lose the race, and that is why James Bond stops the race and allows the Ferrari to win. Bond goes to a casino in Monte Carlo, and this was filmed on location in Monte Carlo. And Bond runs into the lady in the red Ferrari while playing Baccarat, or chemin de fer. And Pierce Brosnan finally introduces himself as James Bond.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
And Bond discovers that her name is Xenia Onatopp. And when Bond asks,
On top?
she answers,
On the top.
and Bond realizes that they're more to her than meets the eye. And that night, Onatopp is making love to a Canadian admiral named Chuck Farrell, and she begins to squeeze her legs and crushes his ribcage, suffocating him to death, while Ormoff steals his ID and they're going to replace him with a doppelganger. Bond is authorized to investigate, and he gets on the Canadian yacht to find Admiral Chuck Farrell dead with a huge grin on his face. And Xenia and General Ormoff plan to steal the Eurocopter Tiger helicopter, which can withstand an electromagnetic pulse. Maybe they use the microchip designed by Max Zorin. Xenia kills the Tiger helicopter pilots and takes their place, and Bond tries to stop them but is stopped by the French soldiers. The movie goes on to a computer facility in Severnaya in Siberia, and we meet two computer programmers, Natalya Simonova, played by Izabella Scorupco, and Boris Grishenko, played by Alan Cumming. And we get the feeling that Boris is kind of a loser and maybe a sexual harasser, but we'll later find out that he is also a traitor. Then General Ormoff and Xenia arrive at the facility with the Tiger helicopter, and they're working for the Janus Syndicate. Janus, aka Janus, the Roman god of two faces. Get it? Two-Face? This is our first hint that they're working with a revived 006. And Xenia takes a machine gun and murders the entire facility, and we see that she's getting turned on by this murder. She is one sick puppy and an intriguing and awesome Bond villain. And even Ormoff realizes how sick she is. However, Natalya was not in the programming room because she was on a coffee break and has survived the shooting. Ormoff and Xenia have come to the Siberian control room where they plan to take over the GoldenEye satellite, a weapon left over from the Cold War which can shoot an electromagnetic pulse. And they aim their weapon at the Severnaya base and then take off in their EMP immune helicopter. And this is a great sequence where the Russians send 3 MiGs and even they fall to the electromagnetic pulse. And this entire sequence, as great and convincing as it looks, was all done with miniatures, and that is amazing. Bond heads to the new MI6 office, where this is where art and reality merge, because the MI6 office that we see here is the new MI6 SIS building in real life. This new MI6 SIS building is the headquarters building of Britain's Secret Intelligence Service in London and is located at the south bank of the River Thames in Vauxhall, or Vauxhall as it's known in England. And it's a beautiful postmodern building that looks like a work of art. And it was completed in 1994, so Eon decided to similarly make it the movie's MI6 headquarters. And the shot of MI6 used in this movie is the real MI6 headquarters. At MI6, we meet the new Moneypenny, played by Samantha Bond, no relation, and she's going to play Moneypenny in all the Pierce Brosnan films. And she's cute, she's tough, and she has this great chemistry with Pierce Brosnan, bringing back the electric relationship between Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell. During the Roger Moore era, Bond and Moneypenny felt more like brother and sister, while Carolyn Bliss's Moneypenny seemed to have an unrequited crush on Dalton's Bond. But here, the electricity is back, and I love this new relationship.
What would I ever do without you?
As far as I can remember, James, you've never had me.
We then meet Michael Kitchens as Bill Tanner, the chief of staff, who was one of Ian Fleming's original characters in Casino Royale, and made his first movie appearance in The Man with the Golden Gun, played by Michael Goodliff. Then we meet M, and she's played by the incomparable Judi Dench. And this is the first time M is played by a woman, but actually the idea to have a female M was originally suggested by Lois Maxwell, who played Money in the previous movies. And during A View to a Kill, she suggested to have Moneypenny be promoted to M, where she would be Bond's new boss. And I really liked that idea. Now initially, when Judi Dench was cast as M, fans did not react well to the idea of M being a woman. However, the second people saw her performance on screen, all doubts disappeared. Now, it should be mentioned that the actual head of British intelligence, the director of MI5 at the time, was actually a woman. Her name was Stella Remington, who held the top position from 1992 to 1996. So not only is it appropriate for the theme of the film, but it actually reflects real-world events at the time. And Judi Dench is incredible here. She's tough, she oozes charisma, and I get chills every time I hear her talk. And she accuses Bond of being,
"You're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War."
And with a clear metatextual subtext aimed at the franchise, who many wondered if it was too sexist and misogynistic to be able to successfully market to the younger modern generation who were raised in a period after the Cold War. And what a brilliant solution to the problem. Not only hire a woman to be James Bond's boss, but to call out the problems outright. It was genius, and it worked. And then M has her own Save the Cat moment, where she tells Bond that she has no problem sending him on a life or death mission, but will only do it if it is justified. And then she approves the mission for Bond to investigate. And she tells Bond,
"Come back alive."
and we, the audience, are completely won over by her. And she is totally a sign of the times. She's tough while being feminine, and she's totally believable as MI6's top spy. She's awesome, and it's one of the best things about this movie. So here's something cool. In the script, we get M's real name, and it's never mentioned in the movie, but it's mentioned in the original script. And it was probably a throwaway line, but it's going to become significant since Judi Dench will play M in the next 7 movies. So what is her name? Here we go. Her name is Barbara Maudsley. And here's something even crazier. In the Daniel Craig movies, her name is Olivia Mansfield. The two M's, both played by Judi Dench, are two totally different characters. We also meet Q again, played by Desmond Llewellyn, who is the only actor to be a holdover from the previous movies. And he's sitting down with a cast that turns into a missile, and he gives Bond a pen that is really a grenade, activated by clicking it 3 times, and de-armed by clicking it a 4th time. And we are introduced to Bond's new car, the BMW Z3 Roadster. And this was a new product placement deal that Eon made with BMW, the first German car to have a product placement deal with 007. And it's going to be a huge success. BMW produced 15,000 BMW Z3 Roadsters, and they immediately sold out after the premiere of this movie. In fact, there were rumors that all 15,000 sold out before the release of the movie, just by being associated with James Bond. Then another 21,000 were produced and called the James Bond Edition, and they all sold out within the year. And let's face it, it's a great looking car. However, I think the filmmakers made a huge mistake not to include a car chase in the movie. They introduced a car, but never use it. And of course this was a mistake, because if you introduce a gun in Act 1, it must go off in Act 3. And here the director breaks that cardinal rule, a violation of Chekhov's BMW. Well, the reason why the BMW was not featured in any action car sequences in this movie is actually quite simple and makes a lot of sense. It's because the product placement deal came very late, almost as the movie finished filming, so they couldn't create any major action sequences. Incidentally, the other product placement deals in this movie include Perrier Mineral Water, Omega Watches, IBM Computers, Jack Daniel's Black Label Tennessee Whiskey, and Smirnoff Vodka, among many others. We also meet CIA contact Jack Wade, who is the new Felix Leiter. Because remember, Felix Leiter lost his limbs in the last movie when he was fed to the sharks. Well, this movie keeps up that continuity. But Jack Wade is played by actor Jodan Baker, who also played the villain Brad Whitaker in The Living Daylights. See, Jodan Baker was a good friend of director Martin Campbell and played a similar character in another Martin Campbell film called The Edge of Darkness. So he was the director's top choice to play this character. And Jodan Baker is the 3rd actor to play multiple roles in a James Bond film. Walter Gotell played the villain Morenzi in From Russia with Love and returned to be General Gogol in 5 later movies. And Charles Gray played Henderson in You Only Live Twice, and then Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever. Jack Wade doesn't really know who Janos is, but he knows that Janos is a Cossack. And the Cossacks are Eastern European Slavic Christian ethnic minority residing roughly between Russia and Ukraine. And a little history here, during World War II, many of the Cossacks, not all, but many, sided with Nazi Germany against the Russians. However, after the Allies defeated Germany, they had captured many Cossacks who are now refugees. However, during the Yalta Conference, Britain and the US decided to repatriate the Cossacks back to the Soviet Union, where most of them were executed or sent to labor camps. It was seen as a huge betrayal of the Cossacks by the British and the US. Jack Wade tells Bond that Janos's main competitor is Valentin Dmitrovich Zukovsky, an old KGB officer now turned gangster. And he has a past relationship with Bond, because Bond once shot him in the leg and gave him the limp that he has now. Bond meets with Zukovsky, played by Robbie Coltrane, who is best known for playing Hagrid, and they have a very interesting exchange.
Walther PPK. 7.65 millimeter. Only 3 men I know use such a gun. I believe I've killed 2 of them.
Lucky me.
And in the background is a woman singing Stand By Your Man in a very off-key manner, and the woman is Minnie Driver in one of her first movie roles. And Zukovsky helps set up a meeting with Bond and Janos. And later that night, Bond is relaxing at a hotel spa, and Xenia is stalking him. And we get one of the coolest fight scenes in the history of the franchise, which is the hot tub battle scene between James Bond and Xenia on a top. And it's really one of the most memorable fight scenes, because we're not really sure if they're fighting or making love, and for a moment we feel that Bond isn't sure either. And there's one scene where he gets up and kindly and calmly walks away and reaches for his gun, and she jumps on him and attacks him from the back. But Bond never loses his cool. And now it's become one of the most memorable fight scenes of the entire James Bond franchise.
No. No more foreplay.
So Bond captures Xenia and makes her take him to Janos. And when they meet, it's Alex Trevelyan, 006. And I had so many questions, because was he always bad? Was he already working with Ormov during the opening action sequence? Then why didn't he just kill Bond when he had the chance? Well, presumably the implication is that he always was bad and was indeed working with Ormov during the opening sequence, and that's why they faked his death. Bond is hit with a tranquilizer dart, and when he wakes up, he and Natalya are tied up in the Tiger helicopter, and the missiles are set to blow them up. Yeah, it's another Dr. Evil moment that would drive Scott Evil crazy.
I have a gun in my room. You give me 5 seconds, I'll get it. I'll come back down here. Boom! I'll blow their brains out.
Scott, you just don't get it, do you? You don't.
And Bond makes a narrow escape, but they're quickly arrested by the Russians. And they are interrogated by the Secretary of Defense, General Mishkin. And in an early draft of the script, this was going to be General Pushkin from The Living Daylights, played by John Rhys-Davies. However, they ended up creating a new character, General Dmitry Mishkin. However, General Ormov shows up, murders Mishkin, and Bond and Natalya escape in the building's archives. But Natalya falls and Ormov captures her. And Bond gets to use his belt gadget firing grappling gun and escapes to the outside, where he finds a tank. And this leads to the central action piece of the movie, the sequence that this movie is known for. And so we get James Bond in his impeccable suit calmly driving a huge tank through the streets of St. Petersburg, destroying buildings and wreaking havoc while pursuing Ormov and Natalya, all to the music of the James Bond theme. And James Bond never loses his cool and even takes time to adjust the suit while driving the tank. And then it happens that statue of a charging horse falls on top of it. And it's a great scene, full of subtle humor, worthy of the James Bond franchise. And it's one of the most incredible action sequences in the entire franchise. Ormov and Xenia take Natalya onto Janos' train. However, Bond has rushed ahead and taken the tank to a spot on the tracks in front of 006's train. And Bond in his tank plays chicken with 006 in his train, and Xenia is totally enjoying the possibility of their train being derailed.
He's going to derail us.
Bond shoots a train and jumps out of the tank, and sure enough, the train is derailed. Bond has a drop on 006, who asks,
Why can't you just be a good boy and die?
to which Bond answers,
You first.
However, Ormov takes Natalya hostage, but Bond kills Ormov, and 006 and Xenia escape with the hidden helicopter, leaving Natalya to guess Boris's password and track their base to operations in Cuba. But the train is about to blow up, but Bond uses his laser watch to barely escape as the train explodes. Bond and Natalya head to Cuba, and Bond drives his BMW for a few seconds. Jack Wade shows up, meets them, gives them an airplane, and then he drives off in the BMW while the two search for the island. Then a missile suddenly comes out of a lake and blows them out of the sky, and Xenia appears by dropping out of a helicopter. However, Bond kills the helicopter pilot, causing Xenia to be crushed by a tree in a manner very similar to how she crushed her victims. Bond and Natalya find their main hideout underneath a large artificial lake which conceals a huge satellite dish. And this was actually filmed at the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico. And 006 plans to aim the GoldenEye at London, causing all of London's financial and social infrastructure to shut down, basically causing London to become a Stone Age city. Meanwhile, 006 intends to hack into the Bank of London, steal a substantial amount of money, knowing that GoldenEye's electromagnetic pulse will shut down and erase all bank records, basically hiding all evidence of his crime. However, Natalya hacks into Boris's computer and causes GoldenEye to enter the atmosphere to self-destruct. Boris gets a hold of Bond's pen. Remember, 3 clicks activates the grenade, and the 4th diffuses it. Boris nervously clicks his pen, and Bond counts the clicks. Armed, dearmed, armed, dearmed, and once it is armed, he knocks the pen out of Boris's hand, activating the grenade explosion. Boris then desperately tries to get control over GoldenEye. While 007 goes to the satellite dish to clog up the gears, the 006 stops him, and they engage in a brutal fight. At first, Alex is winning, and he almost sends Bond plummeting to his death, and it's a heart-pounding suspenseful moment. But suddenly, Bond gets the upper hand and is able to dangle Alex over the antenna of the dish before he lets him fall to his death, and it is cold-blooded. Boris is too late, GoldenEye is destroyed, and Natalya commandeers a helicopter and rescues Bond, while the satellite dish malfunctions and explodes, with the debris landing on Alex Trevelyan. Meanwhile, Boris thinks he survived the explosion, but the explosion causes some gas canisters to explode, freezing him into an ice statue. Bond and Natalya are rescued by Jack Wade and the U.S. Marines, who take them to Guantanamo Bay, where they'll get some private time, thus ending a fantastic Bond film, thrusting 007 into the modern blockbuster era. The movie premiered on 13th of November 1995 at the Radio City Music Hall, and it was the first James Bond movie to hold its premiere in New York, and only the second James Bond movie to hold its premiere in the U.S. The 1985 A View to a Kill held its premiere in San Francisco. The movie received positive reviews, and critics loved the bold new direction of the Bond franchise and credited the filmmakers for breathing new life into a languishing film franchise. Roger Ebert gave it a thumbs up and lauded the fresh new direction of Bond, while many critics cited Pierce Brosnan as an upgrade from the last Bond actor. This movie was made on a budget of $56 million, which was a record high for a James Bond movie. However, it was still a pretty modest budget for a standard Hollywood movie. That same year, Batman Forever was made for $100 million, and of course Waterworld was made for $172 million, but that was a famous disaster. The film was a huge box office hit, and GoldenEye made $106 million in the US, making it the highest box office success of any 007 film, beating Moonraker's record when unadjusted for inflation. Then it went on to make a staggering $354 million worldwide, also making it the highest money-making 007 film up to that time when unadjusted for inflation. When adjusted for inflation, Thunderball was still the #1 movie, or at least will be until Skyfall. Adjusted for inflation, GoldenEye was the 4th highest Bond movie. Today, GoldenEye is a fan favorite and is regarded as, hands down, the best of the Pierce Brosnan Bond movies, and regarded as one of the best James Bond movies, period. In 2006, IGN ranked it number 5 out of 23 films, and Entertainment Weekly ranked it number 8. Entertainment Weekly also ranked Xenia Onatopp as the 6th most memorable Bond girl, and IGN ranked Natalya as the 7th best Bond girl. In 2021, in a fan survey conducted by Yahoo, GoldenEye was ranked number 1 best Bond film, with the 2006 Casino Royale ranking number 2 and On Her Majesty's Secret Service ranking number 3. And this is also an important moment where the James Bond films took a huge step into the modern blockbuster age, and the film would usher Bond back into the big leagues. However, this movie left another very important legacy outside of the movie itself, and that is the video game movie tie-in, which actually came out a year later. GoldenEye 007, released in 1997 by Rare Limited, which came out for the Nintendo 64, was a first-person shooter similar to, at that time, Castle Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. And I remember it had a split screen where you could have 4 friends play against each other, and it was a fairly new concept at the time. and it was a huge success, probably responsible for the first-person shooters that you play today, games like Rainbow Six, Medal of Honor, Counter-Strike, and of course, Halo and Call of Duty. And furthermore, this movie finally succeeded at broadening the Bond franchise to a new, younger audience, because a whole new generation of fans, both male and female, became fans of 007 because of GoldenEye. And so it looks like James Bond franchise is off to a very good start with lots of potential. So what did they do with it? Well, we'll discuss that next time when we talk about the 1997 film Tomorrow Never Dies. Well, that ends this video, and if you enjoyed this video, check out my other videos on the James Bond franchise, the Star Trek franchise, and if you want to watch all the James Bond videos, check out this playlist right here. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. In this video, we're going to talk about the 1997 film, Tomorrow Never Dies. So Pierce Brosnan blasted onto the big screen in GoldenEye, winning the entire world over. And while he may not have been the most accurate to the Ian Fleming novels, he won over the worldwide audience and created a new type of Bond, the blockbuster Bond for a new generation. And Pierce Brosnan, who was incredible as a suave but deadly 007 in his James Bond debut, continues to be suave and deadly in this film. And Michelle Yeoh is incredible as Bond's opposite number in the Chinese Secret Service. I have to admit, when this movie came out in 1997, I saw it on opening weekend and I had a great time, but I remember being a little disappointed at that time. Well, now it is almost 30 years later, and we've had 7 more James Bond films, a whole era of the Daniel Craig Bond films, and we're at the dawn of the Amazon Bond movies. And I think I'm at a very different place now in relation to the Bond movies as I was in 1997, which is, almost 30 years ago? Well, I just saw this movie again recently for the first time in over 12 years, and I have to admit, I really enjoyed myself this time. It's a great action-packed movie with spectacular stunts, amazing fight sequences, Pierce Brosnan at his finest, and Michelle Yeoh showing us and the world why she would one day become Queen of the Universe. I had a much better time watching this movie than I thought I would. Now, after the success of GoldenEye, Eon fast-tracked the next 007 movie, which would officially be the 18th Bond film. In fact, the 18th Bond movie was greenlit 6 months before the release of GoldenEye, simply based on the positive reaction to the GoldenEye trailer. Eon received strong pressure from MGM to start making the 18th Bond movie, and one of the reasons was that MGM had just been taken over by billionaire Kurt Kerkorian, and he wanted to release Bond 18 to coincide with their public stock offering. Therefore, the pre-production of this movie was really rushed, hence leading to a lot of the chaos that is associated with the production of this film. They asked director Martin Campbell, who had directed the last film, to return as director, but Martin Campbell refused, saying that he didn't want to do the same project back to back. Martin Campbell would return to direct my favorite Bond film, Daniel Craig's Casino Royale, and he would also direct The Mark of Zorro and the future flop Green Lantern. So for director, they hired Roger Spottiswoode, which was really a weird choice if you think about it, because prior to this movie, the 2 biggest movies he had made was Turner and Hooch and Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. The first draft of the script was written in 1995, and the story involved the return of Hong Kong to China, which was set to occur on July 1997. However, there were several reasons that they decided not to go in this direction. First, they didn't think they could finish the movie by July and felt that they needed the extra 5 months to finish the film. Second, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was acting as a consultant on this film, recommended against it. He stated that if something actually did happen during the handover, the movie could look ridiculous. And thirdly, if you base a movie on a real historic moment, it would immediately date the film, and you want your Bond movie to be relatively timeless. They rehired Bruce Fierstein, who wrote GoldenEye, to return and write the screenplay. And incidentally, GoldenEye was his first produced motion picture screenplay, Tomorrow Never Dies was the second, and The World Is Not Enough would be the third and last screenplay he'd ever write. And how he was able to get the job to write the screenplay for Tomorrow Never Dies was that he pitched it as Words are the New Weapon, Satellites the New Artillery. And they loved it and hired him.
Words are the new weapons. Satellites, the new artillery.
They accepted the screenplay, and then Roger Spottiswoode hired other writers to clean up his script. And one of the writers they hired was Nicholas Meyer. That's right, Nicholas Meyer, who wrote and directed Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, who wrote the screenplay for Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, the one with the whales, and who wrote and directed Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, actually worked on a version of the screenplay. In fact, a whole panel of screenwriters came by and wrote different versions of the script. And apparently there was a lot of conflict on set, with producers not being happy with the script and actors not being happy with the way their characters were written. Pierce Brosnan had gone in interviews to say that the script that were handed on the first day of shooting wasn't very good. So the writers had to continue to write and rewrite the script while filming had already started. There was apparently so much tension on the set that crew members were threatening to quit during production, and about halfway through production, director Roger Spottiswoode and some of the writers just stopped talking to each other. Now, Roger Spottiswoode has later said in interviews that a lot of the reported chaos on set was exaggerated, and that in reality, the morale on the set was not half as bad as what was reported. Apparently, the original title of the script was Tomorrow Never Lies, and apparently it was based on the Beatles song Tomorrow Never Knows. However, there was an error when they were sending this to MGM, and the MGM executives accidentally misread it as Tomorrow Never Dies, and they liked the title so much that they insisted that it be changed. And Tomorrow Never Dies, this is the first title not to have any relation with Ian Fleming. GoldenEye was the first movie not to be based on any of Ian Fleming's books, but it was still named after Ian Fleming's Jamaican beach house. However, sadly, this will be the first film not to involve Albert Cubby Broccoli, who passed away just before this film. And this film would be made entirely by his daughter Barbara Broccoli and his stepson Michael G. Wilson. And this movie is dedicated in his memory. And of course, Broccoli and Wilson wanted Pierce Brosnan to return for the movie because he did have a 4-year contract, and the last one did phenomenally well. And for the Bond girl, director Roger Spottiswoode wanted to have a very strong woman in the Bond girl role, possibly the strongest Bond girl ever. And so he cast Michelle Yeoh to be the main Bond girl in this movie. And I think he succeeded because Wai Lin is arguably the toughest, the most badass Bond girl in the history of the franchise, before and after this movie. When Michelle Yeoh was chosen to be the Bond girl, Pierce Brosnan was very impressed with her, especially by the fact that she did her own stunts, and he was also impressed by her serious work ethic and talent as an actress. And he has been an outspoken fan of hers then and now, and to this day, they're still friends. And I was very excited for this movie because of Michelle Yeoh. Because in 1996, 1 year before this movie, a movie called SUPERCUT, starring Jackie Chan and Michelle Yeoh, was released in the US. And apparently in Hong Kong, SUPERCUT was Police Story 3 SUPERCUT, originally released in Hong Kong in 1992. But I remember my friend Roy and I went to see it on opening weekend, and we were already Jackie Chan fans at the time, but neither of us had heard of Michelle Yeoh, because this was 3 years before Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and it was the 1-2 punch of Tomorrow Never Dies and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon that would turn Michelle Yeoh into an international superstar. But back in 1996, with SUPERCUT, we were absolutely blown away by Michelle Yeoh, and we absolutely fell in love with her, and I became obsessed with her and started to find out all the other movies she had been in. And when I found out that she would be the next Bond girl, I was thrilled, and I couldn't wait for this movie, so I had very high expectations for this film. Now, Michelle Yeoh, birth name Yeoh Chu Kang, she was already a superstar in Hong Kong, known for doing her own stunts. And in 1985, at the age of 22, she starred in her first kung fu film called Yes, Madam, for which she was nominated for Best New Performer at the Hong Kong Film Awards. And in 1992, at the age of 29, she starred in SUPERCUT, aka Police Story 3 SUPERCUT, with Jackie Chan, which made her a Hong Kong superstar. In 1994, she starred in the kung fu classic Wing Chun, which solidified her fame in Hong Kong, making her the top superstar in Hong Kong. Interestingly, she had no martial arts training. She's a ballet dancer by trade, but remember, Jackie Chan was also a dancer, and in Hong Kong opera, the dancing is very acrobatic and rigorous. The year this movie came out in 1997, Michelle Yeoh was listed as People magazine's 50 most beautiful people in the world, and she's going to have an amazing career after this movie. In 2000, she'll star in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which will make her not only an international superstar, but a superstar in the US. And she's going to star in hundreds of very successful films, and in 2008, Rotten Tomatoes ranked her as #1 greatest action heroine of all time. And in 2009, she was listed as People Magazine's 35 all-time screen beauties. She's won numerous awards and recognitions, and in 2002, the International Junior Chamber honored her as Outstanding Person of the World for her cultural achievement, and she's been awarded the French Legion of Honor twice by 2 different French presidents. In her home country of Malaysia in the year 2013, she was awarded the most esteemed Order of the Loyalty to the Crown of Malaysia, which carries the title of Commander, or Tan Sri in Malaysian. So basically, if you Wikipedia or Google her name at the time, she will pop up as Commander Michelle Yeoh. And only 250 people in the entire country of Malaysia can hold that title at any one time. In 2016, she starred as Captain Philippa Georgiou in Star Trek Discovery, and in 2019, she starred in Crazy Rich Asians. And soon she began to conquer Hollywood. And in 2022, she starred in Everything Everywhere All at Once, which won Best Picture and also won her an Academy Award for Best Actress at the 2023 Academy Awards. And today, she's arguably the biggest female superstar in Hollywood right now. And not bad considering that this movie was her big Hollywood premiere. And Michelle Yeoh really loved making this movie and had nothing but high praise for Pierce Brosnan, whom she described as a perfect gentleman. And while much of the cast and crew struggled with the chaotic nature of the production of the movie, it really didn't bother Michelle Yeoh at all. And this is because Michelle Yeoh was used to chaotic productions, because that's how most Hong Kong action movies are made. She was used to it. Now, for the role of the main Bond villain of the entire movie, Elliot Carver, they originally cast Anthony Hopkins. Now remember, they wanted Hopkins to be the mentor of Bond as 006 in GoldenEye. However, that never materialized. But at this time, he accepted the role of Elliot Carver, and he even appeared on set. However, when they started production, Hopkins was apparently so disgusted with the chaos on set and the fact that they didn't have a completed working script, and that every morning he was being handed a new, different script. So he walked off the set after only 3 days of filming. And by April 1997, when filming began, they had no completed script and no actor to play the main villain. And the role of Paris Carver still had not been cast. Eventually, they settled on Jonathan Pryce. However, can you imagine had they got Anthony Hopkins to play this role? I think that would have been amazing. But I do like Jonathan Pryce as an actor, even though at the time I wasn't sure if he was right for this role, because Jonathan Pryce is a prolific actor. Now, he's probably best known for his role as Sam Lowry in Brazil, as well as his role here. But he's also been the customer who sold real estate by Al Pacino in Glengarry Glen Ross. He was in Pirates of the Caribbean. He's also the president that gets kidnapped in G.I. Joe Retaliation. He's been in a lot of supporting roles, and he's always very good in those roles. And in 2008, Jonathan Pryce would also go on to play Ian Fleming in the biography movie. And in 2019, he was nominated for an Academy Award for his portrayal of Pope Francis in The Two Popes, coincidentally enough, playing against Anthony Hopkins. So it all connects. He's a fantastic actor, and he's kind of funny looking, but there's this sort of pitiful and fragile, sympathetic human quality about him that really works in those roles. However, I don't know if he evokes power, and I certainly don't think he evokes evil. He's more sort of goofy and grandfatherly, and that's why I wasn't sure if he worked as a megalomaniac, the big bad who's trying to take over the world. But I have to admit, he's really going for it here, hamming it up and chewing the scenery. Regardless, the director Roger Spottiswoode really wanted Jonathan Pryce for the role, and I think I know why. Now, it seems obvious that the role of Elliot Carver was based on media tycoon Rupert Murdoch, who owns The Sun, The Times, The Daily Telegraph, The Herald Sun, and The Australian, and in the United States owns The Wall Street Journal and The New York Post. He also owns the book publisher HarperCollins and the television broadcasting channels Sky News Australia and Fox News. And as powerful as he was back in 1997, he's even more powerful today, making this movie seem almost prophetic. He pretty much controls the news that we consume today. The producers of this movie adamantly denied that Elliot Carver was based on Rupert Murdoch, but of course they had to say that. You can't openly admit that the villain of your movie was based on a real person. However, the producers of the movie claimed that Elliot Carver was based on another media mogul named Robert Maxwell. And you know this man, or at least you know his daughter, but we'll get to that in a second. Robert Maxwell was a very wealthy, litigious businessman who owned the British Printing Corporation, the Mirror Group newspapers, and Macmillan Publishers, and among other publishing companies. And he died in 1991 at the age of 68. And after his death, it was discovered that Robert Maxwell had embezzled hundreds of millions of pounds from his own company's pension funds. And the Maxwell companies had to file for bankruptcy. And people began to discover just how corrupt he had been. So was Elliot Carver based on Robert Maxwell? Well, all you have to do is read the biographies of Robert Maxwell and Rupert Murdoch on the internet, like on Wikipedia, and you can clearly see that Robert Maxwell's life was nothing like Elliot Carver. But Rupert Murdoch? You can see some similarities, but I'll leave that to your own opinion. And the reason why I bring this up is because Roger Spottiswoode really wanted Jonathan Pryce to play Elliot Carver. And I always wondered why. Well, go to Google and search an image of Rupert Murdoch in the 1990s, and you'll realize how much he resembles Jonathan Pryce. And then you have to go to YouTube and find an interview with Rupert Murdoch, and you realize that Jonathan Pryce is doing a perfect copy of Rupert Murdoch's voice. I mean, that's exactly how he talks.
When we bought it, they just started the Saturday edition, and everyone was very divided on whether this...
So Elliot Carver is not based on Rupert Murdoch? My foot. Incidentally, in a 2005 interview with Kevin Collette, director Roger Spottiswoode admitted that Elliot Carver really was based on Rupert Murdoch. Now, I said that you already know Robert Maxwell's daughter. Well, his daughter is Ghislaine Maxwell, who has been in the news for her association with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, for the role of Paris Carver, originally they considered Celia Ward. You'll recognize Celia Ward when you see her. She's had small supporting roles in a lot of famous movies, but she's probably best known for her film role as Harrison Ford's wife that gets murdered in The Fugitive. She played Jake Gyllenhaal's mother in The Day After Tomorrow, and she also plays Jo Danville in CSI New York. And I like her. I think she would have been great. She's beautiful, she's tough, and she gives off an academic intelligence that I think would have worked for this role. And I believe this is the kind of woman that James Bond would have fallen for. However, the producers at the time thought she was too old, even though she was 41 years old at the time, and Pierce Brosnan was 43 years old during filming, even though he would be 44 when the movie would come out. And I thought that was just ridiculous. And one of the other actresses considered was Monica Bellucci, who screen tested for the role, but the producers just didn't like her and they didn't hire her. Monica Bellucci is best known in the US for her portrayal as Persephone in The Matrix Reloaded and Matrix Revolutions, and in 2015, she'll get to play Bond's love interest in Spectre. And in 2024, she'll play Beetlejuice's cursed wife in Beetlejuice. She has this smoky intensity and charisma, and when they didn't hire her, Pierce Brosnan just thought the producers were fools for not hiring her. They decided to go with Terry Hatcher, who at that time was best known for her role as Lois Lane in Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, as well as the girl with perfect breasts in Seinfeld.
And by the way, they're real and they're spectacular.
And then she would go on after this movie to play Susan Delfino in the brilliant run on Desperate Housewives. And she'd be nominated for an Emmy and win a Golden Globe for that role. So she is a great actress, and I like her overall, but I'm just not sure if she's right for this role. And apparently Terry Hatcher auditioned for the role because she said that her husband, actor John Tenney, who I always think of as playing Johnny Behan in Tombstone, encouraged her to audition, saying that he'd always wanted to be married to a Bond girl. And later she said that she regretted playing the role because she eventually thought the character was so bland and unsatisfying, and she was 3 months pregnant at the time, so she really couldn't do any of the love scenes. And sadly enough, 6 years later, she and John Tenney divorced anyway. Now, there were some tensions between Pierce Brosnan and Terry Hatcher, and it really got bad when Terry Hatcher was late to the set. And he was angry at first, but then he found out that she was pregnant, and he really felt bad, and later regretted being so cold to her on the set. For much of the special effects, like previous Bond movies, they used a lot of miniatures. After all, there were a lot of shots of British Navy ships, and the British Navy did allow the crew to board their ships and film the interiors. But of course the Navy couldn't allow the crew to fire torpedoes, and certainly wouldn't let the crew sink one of their ships. So they decided to do it with miniatures. Now unfortunately, Derek Meddings, who had starred with the Bond franchise with Live and Let Die, and made a record number of miniatures with GoldenEye, passed away after completing GoldenEye. So for this movie, they hired John Richardson to succeed Derek Meddings in making the miniatures. So Carver's Stealt Ship was a miniature. The British ships, the HMS Devonshire, which was destroyed by the Stealt Ship and sunk, was a miniature. and the HMS Bedford, which destroys the Stealt Ship, was also a miniature. The drill torpedo was a miniature, the sunken HMS Devonshire underneath the water was a miniature, and in the scene where Bond remote controls his BMW, some of the complicated action stunts were done with the BMW actually being a miniature. The ocean battles were filmed at a huge water tank in Baja Film Studios in the town of Rosarito, 10 miles south of the US-Mexican border, which in 1997, James Cameron had built a huge water tank for Titanic at a cost of $20 million, and it holds 17 million gallons of water. So soon afterwards, Tomorrow Never Dies will use it, and it'll be the go-to place for Hollywood to rent and film when they need a huge amount of water. It is regarded as the biggest and best water tank in the world. And in 1999, they'll film Deep Blue Sea. In 2000, they'll film Pearl Harbor. And in 2003, they'll film Master and Commander, as well as many other movies. Ironically enough, it was owned by Rupert Murdoch before he sold it to Baja Acquisitions in 2007. Now, one of the casts that kind of got screwed over is Ricky Jay. And unfortunately, a lot of his scenes ended up on the cutting room floor. So he just comes across like a very unmemorable henchman who just happens to hack computers. However, in reality, he was supposed to be more of a supervillain. Ricky Jay, or Richard J. Potash, is an American magician, and he is one of the most famous and respected sleight-of-hand artists in the magic world. And his hallmark trick is that he can throw cards and make them stick to walls like throwing knives. And it's for real. There's no special effects in this. He can really make throwing cards stick to walls, and you really sense that these simple throwing cards could be deadly weapons in his hands. And that's why he was hired. And in a deleted scene, he would use throwing cards and throw them as deadly weapons at Bond. However, for some reason, they decided not to use that footage, and so Ricky Jay and his character, Henry Gupta, pretty much does nothing other than just kind of stand around and be a very standard henchman. And it's a shame. Now, incidentally, Ricky Jay is so good at magic and sleight of hand that he was actually hired by the CIA, the real CIA, to teach their agents how to pick pockets and to pass items between agents without detection. And did you ever wonder about the name, Henry Gupta? Well, in the original script, Henry Gupta was described as a young man from India. In some alternate reality, there's probably another better version of this movie where Anthony Hopkins is Elliot Carver, Celia Ward or Monica Bellucci is Paris Carver, where Pierce Brosnan has amazing chemistry with Michelle Yeoh, and where Ricky Jay attacks Bond with throwing cards like he's a supervillain in a Marvel movie. For the musical score, they wanted to rehire John Barry, who had not scored a James Bond movie since The Living Daylights. However, they could not agree to John Barry's salary demands, and ultimately, John Barry declined, but recommended his friend David Arnold. And sure enough, David Arnold was hired to do the score. Now, the movie starts out with a terrorist bazaar on the border of Russia, and Bond is infiltrating the arms market and first knocks out a man who is smoking and then says,
Filthy habit.
And this is a hallmark of the new age of Pierce Brosnan Bond, in that Bond does not smoke. We spot one of Elliot Carver's men. This is Ricky Jay, who really got robbed of a more prominent role, but he's here. But like the rest of the movie, he really doesn't do anything but stand around. Meanwhile, in England, the high brass at MI6, including M and Admiral Roebuck, are watching the scene through Bond's camera. Incidentally, Michael Kitchen, who played Chief of Staff Bill Tanner in GoldenEye, was not available for this movie, so they created Deputy Chief of Staff Charles Robinson, played by Colin Salmon. And I love how despite M and Bond having some tension in the last movie, already she has complete respect for him now and has complete faith in him. And when Admiral Roebuck angrily asks,
What the hell is he doing?
She answers,
His job.
And it's an amazing M moment. And Admiral Roebuck gets impatient with Bond and orders a missile to destroy the arms bazaar. And the British ship launches a missile on the Admiral's command, and it does say that it'll arrive at its target in 3 minutes. And this gives us a ticking time clock of 3 minutes for Bond to save the day, because Bond notices that one of the Russian L-39 jets actually has a nuclear bomb. That means that if the missile destroys the area, it could trigger a nuclear explosion, hence triggering a major international incident that the British will be responsible for, not to mention the death and destruction the nuclear bomb might cause. Admiral Roebuck orders the destruction of the missile to abort the bombing, but it's too late. The missile's already out of range and is headed toward its target. And now it's up to Bond to get that nuclear missile out of the target area. He knocks out the pilot and gets in the seat, but another L-39 also launches in pursuit. And the missiles arrive at the target and we think Bond may have been blown up, but Bond's jet flies out of the explosion. And as they're about to have an aerial dogfight, the pilot in Bond's plane wakes up and starts to choke Bond from the back. And this is such a great action scene. Bond is fighting another jet while being choked to death from behind and steering his jet with his knees. And Bond flies a jet underneath the enemy jet and ejects a pilot who blows into the enemy jet, destroying it. And he says,
Backseat driver.
and Bond asks the Admiral where he'd like his bombs to be delivered. And in my opinion, it is one of the best pre-credit action sequences in the entire franchise so far. And then we get the musical montage, which is an incredible visual feast. But first, we have to talk about Sheryl Crow's song. Now, I have to say, I am a huge Sheryl Crow fan. She was one of my favorite pop stars in the early 90s, and I love My Favorite Mistake and All I Want to Do and Soak Up the Sun. But one of my favorite songs of all time is If It Makes You Happy. And back in 1996, this is one of the songs that I'll play over and over again, and I just love it. And I want to say how much of a Sheryl Crow fan I am so that you can appreciate how much it hurts for me to say that I'm kind of lukewarm on this song. I mean, I can appreciate it as a Sheryl Crow song, and I do love hearing her voice. She's just got a great voice. But something about the song just doesn't say to me James Bond. And I'm not alone, because apparently this is one of the lower tier James Bond songs, with many fans preferring Katie Lang's Surrender, which appears at the end of the movie. And I have to admit, that song does feel a little more James Bond than this Crow's version of the song. Now the visual montage is incredible, evoking computer circuits as beautiful artwork, and I absolutely love it. Now the movie proper starts with the British ship, the HMS Devonshire, which accidentally sails off course and ends up in Chinese waters, where 3 Chinese jets make their appearance. The Chinese want to know what the British are doing inside Chinese territorial waters, while the British insist that they're in international waters. And we get a quick blink and you'll miss it early roll by Gerard Butler. Well, it turns out that someone is using a decoder to mess with the British navigational system, and it's our computer hacker, Ricky J, or Henry Gupta, who has hacked into the Devonshire and has given them incorrect coordinates. And there's a quick blink and you miss it moment where Henry Gupta puts down a pack of cards on his desk, one of the remnants of his deadly card skills that was deleted out of the movie. And while the HMS Devonshire think they're in international waters, they really have gone into Chinese territory. And suddenly, a mysterious ship appears, evoking the supertanker in The Spy Who Loved Me, and this will turn out to be Carver's Stealt Ship, which is invisible to radar. And they launch a robotic drill torpedo that can burrow holes in ships and destroy a ship from the inside. And if you think this stealth ship is pure science fiction, it is not. This ship is actually based on a real stealth ship called the Sea Shadow that Lockheed actually built for the US Navy, and the real ship resembles the shape of Carver's stealth ship used here. Now, a few of the sailors of the Devonshire survived the sinking of their ship, but Carver's other main henchman, Stamper, kills the crew of the HMS Devonshire with Chinese machine guns. And then they blow up one of the Chinese jets and make it look like the British did it. And as for Stamper, well, this is a rule in the James Bond movies. When you have a tall, muscular European man with bleached blonde hair, he is almost always the bad guy. And in an earlier version of the script, Stamper was to have a brain injury where he would misinterpret pain as pleasure and misinterpret pleasure as pain. Now that trait was eventually dropped, but they would use this idea of the villain who can't experience pain in the character of Renard in the next movie, The World Is Not Enough. Turns out that a mysterious third party, which we'll find out is Elliot Carver, is trying to provoke a fight between the British and the Chinese, possibly trying to trigger World War III. And this evokes You Only Live Twice, where Spectre was trying to provoke a war between the Americans and the Russians, and then again, where Stromberg was trying to provoke a war between the Americans and the Russians in The Spy Who Loved Me. And since the GPS encoder gave the British the wrong coordinates, they'll continue to have the wrong coordinates in locating the sunken wreckage of the HMS Devonshire. And it turns out that Elliot Carver and his news conglomerate, the Carver Media Group, is doing this whole thing just for news ratings. And we get Jonathan Pryce playing Elliot Carver, or should I say, Rupert Murdoch. And we get Elliot Carver's Blofeld moment where he has teleconferences with his various high-level minions across the world. And here we get a really cool cameo. That's Eon's producer, Michael G. Wilson, Cubby Broccoli's stepson. And I have to admit, once you realize that Jonathan Pryce is doing a spot-on impersonation of Rupert Murdoch, I'm starting to appreciate him more in this movie. Now, back when this movie came out in 1997, with the deregulation of news in the 1980s, and then eventual penetration of the 24-hour cable news into every minute of our lives, it was terrifying how much a handful of media corporations were able to shape the way we thought and felt about the world events. And it may have possibly seemed far-fetched that a media mogul would cause World War III for ratings, but now we know this movie was quite prescient. Because now in 2025, with the growth of the internet and how powerful the media has become, completely shaping our thoughts and how we perceive our reality, pitting one group of people against another at the whim of the media elites, this movie seems to have been an oracle that perfectly predicted the future 30 years ago. And today, I think most of us would completely be surprised if a handful of media moguls aren't completely shaping and manipulating the wars and geopolitics of our times. We then go to James Bond, who is making love to some random woman, apparently his French instructor, at the university, but Moneypenny calls him for a mission. Back at MI6, the British military is convinced that the Chinese want a war, but M isn't quite sure about the Chinese. And the Admiral quips to M,
With all due respect, M, sometimes I don't think you have the balls for this job.
And M retorts right back,
Perhaps. But the advantage is I don't have to think with them all the time.
It's an awesome comeback, and M just keeps on winning. And some felt that the dynamic between M and Admiral Roebuck almost felt like an old married couple. Well, Dame Judi Dench, who played M, and Jeffrey Palmer, who played the Admiral, actually played a married couple in the long-running 1992 TV series As Time Goes By. And we get a nice scene where Bond is being briefed by M and Deputy Chief of Staff while driving around town in a car. And M thinks it's fishy that Carver got out the news of the Chinese attack so quickly, even before MI6 received their intelligence briefing. And M sends Bond to Carver's headquarters in Hamburg to investigate. And she knows that Bond used to have a relationship with Carver's wife, and she suggests that he go,
Then pump her for information.
So what a difference 2 years makes. In GoldenEye, she was blasting Bond for being a sexist, misogynistic dinosaur, and now she's ordering him to use his sex appeal to seduce Carver's wife and use her for information. Bond goes to Hamburg and he meets up with Q, who presents him with his loaded BMW. And there was an interesting deleted scene where Q has a Jaguar, not the Jaguar car, but a real live feral Jaguar, and then he says,
Wrong assignment.
And now I want to see that assignment. Well, this BMW was another product placement. This is the BMW 750iL E38, and it's one of the two BMW product placements in this movie. The other is the BMW motorcycle that Bond and Wai Lin drive through the streets of Vietnam. Other product placement deals include Heineken beer, Ericsson cell phones, Omega watches, Avis rental car, as well as the Electronic Arts video game Tomorrow Never Dies. And I love this BMW because not only does it have tons of gadgets, but it's remote controlled by using a cell phone, which is also a taser. Bond heads to the party held by Alec Carver at the Carver Media Group headquarters, and here we meet our main Bond girl, Wai Lin, played by the incomparable Michelle Yeoh. And of course she'll be Bond's opposite number in the Chinese Secret Service, evoking The Spy Who Loved Me, where Bond's British top spy teams up with Anya Amasova, the Soviets' top spy. And then we meet Paris Carver, played by Terry Hatcher. And it's crazy to think that we could have had Monica Bellucci in this role, and Pierce Brosnan really wanted Monica Bellucci. And I think Celia Ward would have also been just as good. Now, Terry Hatcher does an adequate job, but due to her young age, it's hard to believe that they were old sweethearts. Remember, Pierce Brosnan was 43 years old during filming, and Terry Hatcher was only 32 years old. And that's a great age difference. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the idea that maybe they knew each other a long time ago, but it would have really been cool to think that they knew each other like in college or something. But being 11 years age difference really takes that idea away. And another problem is that Terry Hatcher is just so American. She's very spunky and energetic, and that's what made her so perfect for the role of Lois Lane or Susan Meyer. But I don't think she has that sophisticated European aristocracy that they're trying to imply with this role. I think both Monica Bellucci and even American Celia Ward could have pulled that off much better. Well, enough hating, let's talk about some good things about Terry Hatcher's performance. First, she does add a little more star power to the role, much more than Bellucci or Ward would have provided. In the 90s, there was a time when Eon was marketing Bond to a younger generation, and Terry Hatcher was hot at the time. Second, she is drop-dead gorgeous here in this role. and you absolutely buy that she'd be the perfect trophy wife for some media billionaire. And third, she does have excellent chemistry with Pierce Brosnan. The second you see both of them on screen, you really feel that they're going to hook up eventually, and it is magnetic. So when Paris introduces Bond to her husband, Elliot Carver, Bond begins to poke the bear by asking intrusive questions.
Tell me, Elliot, I was just wondering about your satellites, the way you've positioned yourself globally. Say if you wanted to manipulate the course of governments, or even a ship. No, I'd be lost at sea. Adrift.
And Carver gets upset and has his goons take Bond to the back and beat him up, but Bond is able to defeat the men, and then he gets to give Carver a little FU by shutting off the power during his big presentation. And it's classic Bond, the kind of FU that Sean Connery or Roger Moore would do to the villain all the time. Bond goes back to his room and waits for the goons, and he assumes that Carver will send one of them. And I love this. Pierce Brosnan is just so Bond, and good luck to any poor assassin that dares try to go after 007. But to his surprise, Carver has sent his wife Paris to get information on him. The two make love, and Paris decides to betray her husband in order to help Bond, and she gives him information about Carver's newspaper facility and printing press, and that the GPS encoder that allowed Carver's henchman Henry Gupta to hack into the Devonshire's navigational system and send the British ship off course is hidden there. So Bond successfully sneaks into the facility and finds the decoder. And Bond runs into Wai Lin, who is also there looking for the GPS encoder. She trips the alarm, which activates the guards to shoot at Bond. Bond is able to escape, but sees Wai Lin escaping in the coolest way, and I really love this scene. She's walking down suspended on wires. And it paints Wai Lin as another master spy who's as good at her job as Bond is. And it makes you feel like Wai Lin is also having her own Chinese Secret Service adventure, and this is just a brief moment where their separate missions happen to intersect. And I love it. Bond makes it back to the hotel in time to hear a news report that Elliot Carver's wife, Paris Carver, has died. And once more, it is Elliot Carver reporting on news as it happens because he really murdered her. And when Bond sees Paris dead, he is really devastated. But then he hears on the news that James Bond's body was also found next to her. And when he turns around, he sees Carver's hitman, Dr. Kaufman, played by Vincent Schiavelli, a forensic medicine doctor who is also a professional assassin on the side. And he is an expert at human torture and is Stamper's mentor when it comes to torture. And let's face it, this scene here is the best scene in the movie, and arguably one of the coolest scenes in the entire franchise. And Vincent Schiavelli is one of those actors that just pops up everywhere, especially when you need some funny-looking guy, but he's always so memorable whenever he appears on screen. Now, he's probably best known as the ghost that mentors Patrick Swayze on the subway in Ghost, but he's been in so many things. He's the creepy teacher in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. He was the alien in Buckaroo Banzai. He was in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I can't list everything he's been in because he's been in so much, but he's been in hundreds of movies and TV roles. So Bond is at the mercy of Dr. Kaufman, while we see Carver's goons try to break into his super BMW to get the GPS encoder. And I love that the car is impervious to sledgehammers and gunshots, and even electrocutes anyone trying to get in. And Kaufman asks Bond to open the car door under threat of torture, but Bond tricks him into taking the cell phone and tasering himself. And Bond is able to get the upper hand and points Kaufman's own gun at his head, and Kaufman begs,
I'm just a professional doing a job.
And Bond says,
Me too.
and kills him in cold blood. And it's an awesome moment, one of the best in the Bond franchise. And then we get the central action piece of the movie, the car chase. And it's a very worthy sequence. Bond jumps back into the back seat of his BMW and remote controls the car, and what sells the scene is that Bond is sitting back in the back seat and he looks like he's really enjoying himself as if he were really playing some fun video game. And this scene took 10 days to film, and they used 17 BMWs. They ended up destroying 15 BMWs to shoot the entire sequence, while 2 survived. Now apparently the windshield has taken enough hits that it finally breaks, but that's when the bad guys shoot a missile that goes through the car. Now when the bad guys throw a bunch of caltrop spikes on the ground, which bursts the tires of the BMW, Bond just reinflates the tires. And it is so awesome. Now Bond takes the GPS encoder and jumps out of the car, which the goons follow the BMW to the roof, where he sends the car flying across the sky, landing in the Avis rental shop. and thus ends an incredible action sequence worthy of some of the best car chases in the Bond franchise. Although a small part of me is worried that someone could have gotten hurt when the BMW flew through the air and plowed into the Avis storefront. After all, it was a pretty crowded street, and any time innocent bystanders are harmed in a movie car chase, it really does bother me for some reason. While Bond has succeeded in his mission, he's gotten information about Carver, and he's obtained the GPS encoder. He then heads to a U.S. Air Force base in Okinawa, which I must assume is probably Kadena Air Base, but this scene was actually filmed in RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, England. And here he meets up with Jack Wade, played again by Jodan Baker. And here Bond is once again wearing his Navy uniform, and Pierce Brosnan looks great in his Navy service dress. And this is likely a callback to both You Only Live Twice and The Spy Who Loved Me, the only two other times James Bond wore his Navy uniform. Now, using the GPS encoder, they're able to discover the real location where the HMS Devonshire was sunk. However, the wreckage is in Chinese territory, and if Bond wants to investigate the wreckage, he has to secretly infiltrate into Chinese waters. And therefore, he does a halo jump. This is a high-altitude, low-opening jump that significantly decreases the chances of being detected by enemy radar. In other words, this will allow Bond to go into Chinese territorial waters without the Chinese government detecting them. A halo jump is where a parachutist free falls from a height of anywhere from 15,000 feet to 35,000 feet high, where they plummet to the ground for 7 miles, which is about 2 minutes in the air, reaching a terminal velocity of 126 miles per hour. And at an altitude of 35,000 feet, it is usually negative 45 degrees, and the jumper can experience frostbite. Therefore, the jumper has to wear a polypropylene knit with a windproof shell which keeps them warm during the jump. And this halo jump was really done practically for this movie, and it was performed by James Bond regular stuntman B.J. Worth, one of the big MVPs of the James Bond franchise. And you know him as a stuntman who did the free fall jump in Moonraker. He did the aerial jump off the airplane in Octopussy, and he did the Eiffel Tower jump in A View to a Kill, as well as the fight scene on the back of the airplane in The Living Daylights, as well as many, many more. And for Tomorrow Never Dies, he performed 80 halo jumps for the movie. Now Bond finds the wreckage of the HMS Devonshire, and as he investigates, he runs into Wai Lin. Like, what? How did Wai Lin find the wreckage? And at exactly the same time as Bond? Now, I don't really know what's going on. How did she find it? Like, if you know and can help me understand, please comment below. Well, the two discover that Carver has taken one of the missiles off the ship, and they almost die on the ship, but they barely escape. But when they make it to the surface, they're captured by Stamper and his men. And Bond and Wai Lin are handcuffed to each other and taken to Carver's Media Group headquarters in Saigon. Now, originally, Eon had planned to film the sequence in Saigon. However, the Vietnamese Ministry of Culture and Information made too many demands and they could not reach an agreement. And therefore, Bangkok, Thailand had to substitute for Saigon, Vietnam. Elliot Carver orders Stamper to torture them, and Stamper is more than happy to hurt the man who killed his mentor. And in the background we see Henrik Gupta, who is relegated to the role of fat computer hacker rather than the original supervillain who kills people with throwing cards. But just before being tortured, Bond and Wai Lin attack the guards and escape by jumping out of the building and hanging on a huge tower banner of Elliot Carver's face. And once again, this stunt was done practically. Stunt performers Mark Southworth and Wendy Leach actually jumped out of a skyscraper, specifically the Sin Sathorn Tower in Thailand. And they make it to the streets of Saigon and they steal a motorcycle, and it's a BMW motorcycle, the second product placement deal between Eon and BMW. And here we're going to get the second action sequence. And the idea for this sequence came by when they knew they had to match the sequence of Bond driving through the streets of St. Petersburg in a tank. So how do you beat a tank through a major city? Well, Roger Spottiswoode knew that he couldn't top a tank, so he went with the opposite. And what is the opposite of a huge tank where you're completely covered and protected in armor? Well, how about a small motorcycle where you have no covering and no protection and you're completely vulnerable? So Bond and Wai Lin are still handcuffed to each other, so they try to shift around a moving motorcycle to try to get comfortable and find an optimal way to ride the bike. And you feel that they're competing with each other as to who gets to drive the motorcycle. But being handcuffed to each other, they really can't get a correct position. And it's a nice gimmick. Now, director Roger Spottiswoode took Pierce Brosnan and Michelle Yeoh aside separately and without each other's knowledge told each of them not to let the other get in the motorcycle seat. And this added to the genuine feel that the two were competing to drive the bike. Carver's men chase them in a helicopter, and we get an exciting chase through the streets and alleys of Saigon. And in one scene, they jump over the helicopter. And once again, this stunt was really done practically. Stunt performer Jean-Pierre Gois rode the BMW R1200C Cruiser and jumped over a helicopter. Now, there were no wires, there were no cables. He really jumped over the helicopter from one building and landed on the other. However, there were no blades on the helicopter. The blades were added later digitally after the jump. Now, Bond and Wai Lin ride their motorcycle on the balconies of the alley and collapses the balcony as they ride on it. And then they land in a marketplace. And the helicopter uses its blades to try to kill Bond and Wai Lin, and this is an idea that Roger Spottiswoode had. Now, this scene would have been way too dangerous to film, and how they accomplished it was they had a helicopter body on a hydraulic lift without any blades, and the helicopter body was moved around and the blades were added later using CGI. And as the helicopter is about to shred Bond and Wai Lin, they grab a clothesline and they charge the helicopter like David attacking Goliath. And the two slide underneath the helicopter and throw the clothesline at the blades, causing the helicopter to crash, killing Carver's goons. And Wai Lin then uses her earrings to pick the lock of her handcuff and leaves Bond by himself. However, Wai Lin is attacked by more goons, this time Chinese goons, and she has to fight them off by herself. And you know this scene had to be coming, because when you have Hong Kong's top female kung fu action star in your movie, there's no way you're not going to have a kung fu fight scene. And sure enough, this movie suddenly turns into a Hong Kong kung fu movie, and Michelle Yeoh is fantastic and really kicks butt. And there's a reason why this movie looks like a Hong Kong action movie. The goons in this movie are from Jackie Chan's stunt team, who was hired for the sequence. And I like the juxtaposition of the two fighting styles. Wai Lin is an expert martial artist, but she's smaller and has to use multiple kicks and punches to stop a goon. On the other hand, Bond is much larger and stronger, and he can knock out bad guys with one punch. And then one of the goons almost gets a drop on Wai Lin, but Bond has found them in time and knocks him out. And Bond notices that the goons are carrying standard Chinese-issue handguns, which means that the Chinese military, via General Chang, is trying to stop Wai Lin. And we'll learn later that General Chang and Elliot Carver are actually working together. Now, it turns out that this shack is actually a Chinese Secret Service safe house, and here we're going to get a moment that drives die-hard Bond fans crazy. Because Bond looks at the red keyboard and sees that it has Chinese characters, and he can't read it. So he has Wai Lin use the keyboard. But die-hard Bond fans will point to a moment in You Only Live Twice where Bond tells Moneypenny that he majored in East Asian languages.
Instant Japanese. You may need it.
You forget I took a first in Oriental languages at Cambridge.
Therefore, he should have more than easily read the standard Chinese keyboard. Wai Lin reveals a safe house arsenal, and Bond and Wai Lin stock up on some gadgets. Bond grabs a watch, and then he grabs a new gun, and this is a Walther P99. And this was product placement that Eon had with the Carl Walther Arms Company. And so for the next few movies, Bond no longer carries his signature gun, the Walther PPK. Bond has carried the Walther PPK since Dr. No, but here Bond carries the Walther P99, although he actually gets it from the Chinese. But Bond will carry the Walther P99 here and in the next two films, The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day. And incidentally, Daniel Craig's Bond will go back to the Walther PPK in Quantum of Solace and Skyfall. And once again, this was a very successful product placement deal. For the Walther Company, sales of the Walther P99 went through the roof after this movie. Bond and Wai Lin locate Carver's Stealt Ship and they plant mines all over the ship. However, Carver spots Wai Lin on a security camera and sends Stamper, who captures Wai Lin. But Bond is able to trick Stamper by faking his death, and Stamper reports to Carver that Bond is dead. Carver reveals his plan to Wai Lin that he's working with Chinese General Chang and he'll fire a British missile at Beijing, killing all the top Chinese leaders except Chang, who will conveniently miss the meeting. The missile will trigger a war between the British and the Chinese, but then Chang will come in and broker a peace, making him the most powerful man in China. He will then give Carver exclusive rights to broadcast in China for the next 100 years, making the Carver Media Group the most powerful media conglomerate in the world. And Carver has successfully placed the British and the Chinese on the verge of war, and the Chinese fleet and the British fleet race toward each other. However, MI6, as well as the Chinese equivalent, have received Bond and Wai Lin's message that Elliot Carver is provoking both sides and that neither really want to fight each other. They also inform the British and the Chinese that Carver's stealth ship is lurking about in the area. The British are ordered not to attack the Chinese, but to rather look on the radar for the stealth ship. Bond captures Henry Gupta and takes him hostage in order to trade him for Wai Lin, but Carver just kills Gupta. But Bond has a backup plan. He's placed a grenade that is activated from his Omega watch that he's placed on top of gas canisters. And the grenade creates a huge explosion which allows Wai Lin to escape and also creates enough heat for the radar to detect the stealth ship. And the British fire upon the stealth ship while Bond and Wai Lin fight off Carver's men. Now, unfortunately, while filming the scene, Pierce Brosnan actually got hurt in real life because one of the actors accidentally hit Pierce in the face with his helmet and gashed his upper lip, and he had to be rushed to the hospital where he had 8 stitches. Well, Bond and Wai Lin split up, where Wai Lin goes to stop the stealth ship's engines and Bond goes to stop the missile headed for Beijing. Carver deduces this and sends Stamper to the engine room while he gets a drop on Bond. However, Bond activates a drill torpedo and shreds Elliot Carver with it. Stamper captures Wai Lin again, and she's weighted down with chains and thrown into the water. And Bond has his final fight with Stamper on the missile, and Bond traps Stamper, who is burned by the exhaust of the missile. He then destroys the missile, which destroys the stealth ship, thus preventing World War III. And Bond dives into the water and rescues Wai Lin from drowning, and meanwhile at MI6, M makes up a news story that Elliot Carver has drowned after falling off his yacht, and suicide is suspected. And this is actually an Easter egg, because remember, Elliot Carver was supposedly based on Robert Waxwell, not Rupert Murdoch, wink wink. Well, this is exactly how Robert Maxwell is to have died. He is supposed to have fallen off his yacht, and either suicide or foul play was suspected. The movie ends with the British looking for Bond and Wai Lin, who decide to stay undercover just a little while longer while they share a passionate kiss. Now, this movie was made on an inflated budget of $110 million, and this was a huge budget for a Bond film. GoldenEye, which was the record for the highest budget up to that time, was made for half that at $58 million. That said, with a budget of $110 million, Tomorrow Never Dies is getting close to the budget of a typical Hollywood blockbuster. After all, Jurassic Park: The Lost World had a budget of $75 million, The Fifth Element had a budget of $90 million, and Batman and Robin had a budget of around $150 million. So now the James Bond movies are no longer low-budgeted discount films, but major Hollywood blockbusters. That said, this movie did have a huge amount of product placement, which helped offset the cost. How much product placement did it have? Well, you'll be shocked. Because remember, this movie was made on a budget of $110 million. Well, Tomorrow Never Dies made a groundbreaking $100 million through product placement, essentially covering its entire budget. Therefore, everything this movie made was all profit. In fact, it's still one of the few Hollywood blockbusters to be able to cover its entire production budget simply through product placement. The movie would gross $125 million in the US, which is all profit after sharing the cost with the movie theaters, and eventually go on to gross $339 million worldwide. Again, that's all profit after sharing with the movie theaters. So this was a huge financial success for Eon Films. Now, critically, reception was mixed. Critics generally liked Pierce Brosnan and Michelle Yeoh, and they thought it was a very thrilling movie, albeit a typical paint-by-numbers thriller. But the critics who didn't like it thought it was a fairly generic action film. And while the critics may have thought it was a mediocre film, the audience generally loved it. And CinemaScore audience poll gave it a score of an A-. Roger Ebert loved the film and gave it a thumbs up, calling it exciting with a great villain, and complimented it for having a subtler than usual satire. Gene Siskel also loved the film and also gave it a thumbs up, saying it was the first James Bond movie he had liked in a while. And he praised the villain, Elliot Carver. Both fans and critics universally praised Pierce Brosnan's performance as James Bond, as well as Michelle Yeoh's performance as Wai Lin. And the movie received 4 Saturn Award nominations, and Pierce Brosnan won for Best Actor. And the Sheryl Crow song was nominated for a Grammy Award. And looking back on this film, many praise the film for its prescience in predicting the power of the corporate media. And this film, like GoldenEye, also had a very successful video game tie-in. The game was developed by Black Ops and published by Electronic Arts and released on the PlayStation. And unlike GoldenEye, it was released around the same time as the movie, and to the generation who grew up in the 1990s, this marks a seminal video game of their lives. Think of Tomorrow Never Dies, and where does this rank in your list of favorite James Bond movies? If you enjoyed this video on Tomorrow Never Dies, please check out my other videos on the James Bond franchise. We have Sean Connery films, Roger Moore movies, Timothy Dalton films, and we have Star Trek, Star Wars, comedies like Popeye and Airplane, and I release new videos every week. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. In this video, we're going to talk about the 1999 film, The World Is Not Enough. The movie that has the greatest and longest opening pre-credit action sequence in the entire franchise, until No Time to Die. The movie that has international icon Sophie Marceau, who is arguably the most beautiful Bond girl, who marks the franchise's first true female villain. And it's a movie where Denise Richards totally nails it as a nuclear physicist. Well, maybe not. Due to the financial success of the last movie, Tomorrow Never Dies, MGM went ahead and immediately approved the 19th James Bond film. They did offer Roger Spottiswoode a chance to return as director, but he declined. So Eon producer Barbara Broccoli went searching for a director that she actually liked. And one of her favorite directors was Peter Jackson, after seeing the 1994 Kate Winslet drama Heavenly Creatures. And Peter Jackson was a lifelong fan of James Bond and was really excited about the possibility of directing a Bond movie, and arranged for Barbara Broccoli to have a private screening of his most recent film, the 1996 horror comedy The Frighteners, starring Michael J. Fox. However, Barbara Broccoli basically hated this movie, and she hated it so much that she actually decided not to hire Peter Jackson and ended all negotiations with him. So Peter Jackson went ahead with the project that he was working on at the time, which was to continue to pitch Lord of the Rings all around Hollywood. I wonder how that turned out. A year later, a company called New Line Cinema finally approved Peter Jackson's project, and of course, history was made, and we will talk about the Lord of the Rings series sometime in the future. Now, another director that was considered was American director Joe Dante, who is probably best known for directing Gremlins 1 and 2, and he'd also directed Piranha, The Howling, and Inner Space, among many other movies. However, the director they ended up hiring was a man named Michael Apted, who had directed a lot of 80s classic movies such as Gorky Park, Gorillas in the Mist, The Coal Miner's Daughter, and Nell. And Michael Apted was also known for directing the documentary film series Up. No, not the Pixar animated film Up, but the documentary series that follows 10 boys and 4 girls and followed them every 7 years for 56 years from 1964 to 2019. And over his career, Michael Apted has been nominated for 7 Academy Awards, so he was a big deal. Now, the title of this film was going to be Bond 2000, and they were planning for a 2000 release rather than 1999 by stalling an extra year. However, ultimately they decided to bring this movie out on time in 1999, and they decided to change the title. And they played around with different titles and eventually settled on The World Is Not Enough. And the title is translated from the Latin motto Orbis Non Sufficit, given to George Lazenby's Bond when he researches his own coat of arms in On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
3 Bessons. Good motto, eh? The world is not enough. Vivian's doing a splendid job. Thank you, Mr. Sable Basilisk.
The motto also appears in the original Ian Fleming novels, and it was the motto of King Philippe II of Spain. The title of The World Is Not Enough came from an early idea for this movie, which would have had James Bond facing against his own estranged son, who would be the villain of this movie and who would be seeking revenge against him. And the idea was that Bond had unknowingly fathered a child who had been given up for adoption. And man, that is a dark story. However, this original plot was ultimately rejected. So Barbara Broccoli came up with the idea for this movie in 1997, a month before the premiere of Tomorrow Never Dies. And she was watching a news report on Nightline about how oil companies were vying for control over untapped oil reserves in the Caspian Sea after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this episode reported that the last great oil discovery on the planet was in the region of Eastern Europe. And there were a lot of pipelines in the area, and they discussed these grand reservoirs of oil that existed below the Caspian Sea. And there are all these small towns in the region that had become centers of great affluence and wealth due to oil. And these towns also had these casinos that were emerging. And as it was no longer a Soviet jurisdiction, these major oil companies were fighting to get in there and take the oil. And Broccoli hypothesized that a James Bond villain may want to create a monopoly by destroying all his or her competitors and owning the only pipeline in the region of the Caspian Sea. You can see how this would influence this movie. And Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson hired the screenwriting team of Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. And in 1997, the two wrote uncredited rewrites of An American Werewolf in Paris, and they were primarily known for writing the action comedy film Plunkett and McLean, starring Robert Carlyle. And this was their first James Bond movie script, but from here, they'll go on to write Die Another Day, Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die, and they would also create the James Bond parody, Johnny English. Now, from the start, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade wanted to create a Pierce Brosnan movie that was essentially a Sean Connery film. In other words, go back to the feel of those Sean Connery 007 movies. They wanted to create a very realistic movie with lots of action, with a strong villain, and they also wanted James Bond to have the intensity of Sean Connery's Bond. However, as they wrote, they began to incorporate more humor and more elements associated with Roger Moore, elements like his humor and charm. After Neil Purvis and Robert Wade finished their original version of the script, director Michael Apted wanted the character of Electric King to be further developed, and the studios actually suggested Michael Apted's then-wife, screenwriter Dana Stevens, to come in and do uncredited rewrites. And Dana Stevens was known for writing the 1993 film Blink, the 1998 City of Angels, and the 1999 For the Love of the Game. And today she's probably best known for writing the 2022 film The Woman King. Now, Stevens worked on the script for 3 weeks, increasing the importance of both Electric King and M. And the version was good, and they would eventually use many elements from her script, but it did push James Bond too much into the background. And so Bruce Fierstein was asked to come in and deliver the final rewrite, making sure that James Bond remained the main character and central focus of the movie. Now, Michael Apted wanted a strong European woman to play Electric King. And several famous actresses like Sharon Stone and Vera Farmiga were considered, along with Catherine Zeta-Jones, Mila Jovovich, and Elizabeth Hurley. And even Monica Bellucci was considered again. However, the second Michael Apted met Sophie Marceau, he knew he had his Electric King. And I'm glad they went with Sophie Marceau. You want an actress that can pull off the charisma, that can play and manipulate James Bond. And not a lot of women can pull that off, and I feel she does it very well. However, in the original script, Electric King was not French, but the character of Christmas Jones actually was French. In fact, Christmas Jones was French-Polynesian, and she was an insurance investigator. However, with Sophie Marceau being cast as Electric King, this made them change the character of Christmas Jones to be more American.
Or are you just hoping for a glimmer?
And be very spunky to contrast herself with Electric King. And I'd always been aware that there was this international iconic beauty named Sophie Marceau. And in the 1980s, whenever I visited outside the US, she would be everywhere on posters and magazine covers. But inside the US, she was completely unknown. And in fact, the only time here in the US we learned about her was in the role of Princess Izabella in Braveheart. But other than that, she was pretty much unknown. So it was kind of nice to finally see her really in the spotlight. She is absolutely gorgeous. She's sexy, she's stunning, and she is completely a match for James Bond. And in an early draft of the script, Electric King was portrayed as more sympathetic and more of a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. And she would actually survive the gunshot wound at the end, and at the end of the film, the movie would have James Bond visiting her at a mental hospital. However, this ending was judged to be too dull and too downbeat, and the writers elected for Elektra to be more of a conventional villain, and her death at the hands of Bond provides a very dramatic climax. Sophie Marceau was born in Paris, and she was the child of a shop assistant and a truck driver, and her parents divorced when she was 9. And when Sophie was 14 years old, she and her mother submitted photos to a modeling agency, and actually was certain nothing would come of it, but this led her to her being cast in her first movie, the 1980 French teen comedy, The Party. The movie was a hit, and she quickly became a popular French actress. And in the 1980s, she was huge in Japan, South Korea, and China, and was a cultural ambassador of France throughout the 80s. And in 1995, Braveheart made her an international superstar, and after The World Is Not Enough, in 2002, she made her directorial debut with a feature film, Speak to Me of Love, for which she was named Best Director at the Montreal World Film Festival, and would direct several more successful films. And to this day, she is still named as one of the most popular actresses in China. And in France, she is known as the French people's favorite actress. They also wanted a very strong actor to play the villain, and first offered the role to Javier Bardem, who turned it down. However, Bardem would later play a Bond villain in the 2012 film Skyfall. They then offered the role to Jean Reno, the professional, Leon the Professional, and Reno also turned down the role. Now, Robert Carlyle, who had hit it big in 1997 with The Full Monty, accepted. And Carlyle makes a worthy villain in Renard, and Carlyle was tough. I mean, he's creepy, he's sadistic, and you can tell he is absolutely dangerous. And yet there's also something very sympathetic about this man, and that he can't feel anything, and I really feel in many ways the title can really be about him. Robert Carlyle was born in Glasgow and was raised solely by his father when his mother left them when Robert was only 4 years old. When he was 16 years old, he left school and began to work full-time with his father as a painter. However, he attended night school on his own, and when he was 21 years old, he read Arthur Miller's The Crucible and began to study drama at the Glasgow Art Centre, and later graduated from the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama. At age 21, he and his friends founded a theater company and slowly began to be hired for TV roles. And then in 1996 and 1997, it was the 1-2 punch of being in Trainspotting and then starring in The Full Monty that propelled him to superstar status. And today he is known as a very committed method actor, and before playing a homeless character in Safe, he actually lived on the streets of London, and before playing a bus driver in Carla's Song, he passed a test for the PSV license to drive a passenger bus. And today he is a very prolific film and TV actor, and among his many roles include Durza in Aragon and Don Harrison 28 Weeks Later, and he played Dr. Nicholas Rush in Stargate Atlantis, and Mr. Gold, aka Rumpelstiltskin, in Disney's Once Upon a Time, as well as voicing Gabriel Belmont in the Castlevania video games. Now, I know I'm supposed to hate Denise Richards, everyone seems to, but I have to be honest, she really didn't bother me. And I know this may freak out many friends of mine, but I gotta admit, I actually kind of liked her in this movie. I don't think she was the worst Bond girl. Her character, Christmas Jones, originally started as an insurance investigator, but the filmmakers worried that this was too close to the Thomas Crown affair, released the same year in 1999, where Thomas Crown, played by Pierce Brosnan, is being pursued by Catherine Banning, an insurance investigator. And therefore her character was first changed to a bounty hunter, but later changed to a nuclear physicist. And one of the actresses first considered for the role was Jerry Halliwell, aka Ginger Spice. Now remember, they were heavily trying to market this movie to the younger generation. So the role of Christmas Jones came down to Denise Richards and Tiffany Thiessen of Saved by the Bell and Beverly Hills 90210 fame. And I'm not really sure if Tiffany Thiessen would have been that much better, but you can see the studio executives really trying to market to the younger generation of the 90s. Because while the casting of Pierce Brosnan did bring in a much younger demographic to the Bond franchise, MGM wanted an even younger demographic for this movie, and hence they really pushed for Denise Richards, who was highly recognizable to the younger generation of the 90s. And it apparently worked. The movie appealed to a whole new younger demographic, leading to the highest box office of any Bond film, including the previous two, when unadjusted for inflation. Again, adjusted for inflation, it's still Thunderball. However, critics complained that Denise Richards was not credible as a nuclear physicist, and today she is regarded as one of the lower-tiered Bond girls. And another complaint is that her outfit is more reminiscent of Lara Croft the Tomb Raider rather than a PhD nuclear scientist. And Denise Richards even won a Razzie Award for Worst Supporting Actress. That said, if you're going to enjoy this movie, you just have to shut off your brain and just go with it, because Denise Richards is so beautiful, and it's not difficult to just lean back and have a fun time. And I think she is a pretty good actor here. I really didn't mind her. I thought her acting was fine. I thought she was much better than Stacey Sutton in A View to a Kill, and her character wasn't as annoying as Mary Goodnight in The Man with the Golden Gun. And Denise Richards had a great time starring in this movie and felt that Pierce Brosnan was a total class act. And to this day, she is very honored to have gotten to play a Bond girl. Now I'm curious, were you able to shut off your brain and just enjoy her in the movie, or was she too much of a deal breaker? Where do you rank her among the Bond girls? Let me know in the comments below. So Denise Richards was born in Illinois, and her family moved to California when she was 15. And in high school, she was voted best looking. And after high school, she worked as a model, traveling to New York, Paris, and Tokyo. And then she landed several TV and movie spots, including small roles in Loaded Weapon 1 and bit parts in Saved by the Bell, Married with Children, and Doogie Howser. However, her big break came when she starred in the 1997 film Starship Troopers. And she was voted Blockbuster Entertainment's favorite female newcomer. And in 1998, she starred in the erotic thriller Wild Things with Neve Campbell. And then in 1999, she was cast in this film. And from here, she'd go on to an incredible film and TV career, including a very memorable role in Friends as Ross and Monica Geller's cousin, Cassie Geller, in the episode The One with Ross and Monica's Cousin. And in 1999, she was ranked number 9 in Maxim's 50 Sexiest Women. And in 2001, she was voted number 2 in FHM's 100 Sexiest Women, and number 19 in AskMen.com's 50 Most Beautiful Women. And let's face it, she is almost ridiculously beautiful. And I really like the fact that Elektra King turns out to be the main villain of the movie. And if you think about it, Renard was just the henchman. Yeah, he was just the heavy. She will go down in Bond franchise history to be the first Bond villain that was a woman. And they almost did it with Octopussy, because that was how Octopussy was pitched. But in the end, they made her an actual Bond girl. They made her an ally. But here, they actually do it. And I think it totally works. She is effectively evil. And when I saw this for the first time, I totally fell for it. I was completely fooled, and I was shocked when she turned out to be the villain. There's that moment at the end, that tense moment where you don't know if Bond can actually shoot her. And he does shoot her, just right there in cold blood. And it's such an excellent James Bond moment, and it really tells you a lot about the hardcore character of Bond, but it totally worked. Oh, that scene it gives you shivers. Now, in this movie, James Bond drives a BMW Z8, which was part of a 3-picture product placement deal between Eon and BMW. And other product placement deals include Bollinger, Smirnoff, Omega, Motorola, Electronic Arts, Microsoft, Caterpillar, and Heineken. And for The World Is Not Enough, film studio MGM generated over $100 million in revenue through product placement deals, offsetting the huge $130 million budget. So essentially, that brought this movie's budget to around $30 million. And then, of course, some on top of that for marketing. Now, when the real MI6 learned that the movie wanted to shoot the scene around the headquarters, they actually denied it and took extra steps to prohibit it, citing it being a security risk. However, the Foreign Secretary at the time, Robin Cook, at the urging of the members of Parliament, Janet Anderson, actually overruled them and allowed Eon to shoot around the MI6 headquarters. And she said, after all Bond has done for Britain, it was the last thing we could do for Bond. And I think that is totally awesome. Eon also teamed up with MTV once again to market to American youths. And this was still when MTV was hot, when they were still playing music videos and still had the pulse on the youth demographic. Now remember, they did this before with A View to a Kill, but this time I think they went full throttle to market to the younger demographic, and I think it was a little more successful this time around compared to A View to a Kill. And to build up to the excitement of The World Is Not Enough premiere, MTV broadcast over 100 hours of James Bond movies with Denise Richards presenting the movies. The film starts in Bilbao, Spain, where Bond is having a meeting with a Swiss banker to retrieve money that belongs to Robert King. And during this meeting, a beautiful cigar girl walks in, and Bond sort of does a double take, and she is Maria Grazia Cucinotta, who is really an experienced assassin working for the villain. And in the movie, she is simply named as the Cigar Girl, but in the novelization of World Is Not Enough, her name is Giulietta da Vinci. And while the goons think they have the upper hand on Bond, he activates a trigger in his glasses that blows up his gun, and then he kills all of the goons. And then he gives the most hardcore look, and it is awesome. And whatever you think of this movie, you have to concede that Pierce Brosnan is at his best here as 007. And he grabs the last goon for information, but suddenly he is killed by a knife to the back of the head, and it's the Cigar Girl. The Spanish police arrive, and it looks like Bond may be trapped, but he makes an impressive escape by finding an elastic rope and tying it to one of the goons, and then tie it to himself and jumps down. However, the goon grabs onto the table, so Bond is stuck about halfway to the ground, but then the table leg breaks, allowing Bond to go all the way to the ground floor as he coolly walks away with the briefcase full of money. And in a deleted scene, we would have found out that Renard actually was the sniper that helped James Bond. However, director Michael Apted felt that this was a fairly unimpressive introduction to Renard, whereas his introduction later in the movie was very impressive, so they decided to let that be the introduction of the main villain to us, the audience, thereby giving him a sense of mystery and intrigue throughout the movie. Now, according to the director, this was supposed to be the end of the entire pre-credit action sequence. However, when Michael Apted looked at it, he realized that this pre-credit action scene was way too underwhelming compared to the last two movies, and so he decided to add the entire first opening action sequence of the movie proper, which is the entire boat scene on the Thames. However, this made the opening sequence last 22 minutes, which was way too long, and so Michael Apted had to cut out 7 minutes of that action sequence, which is why the sequence has so many deleted scenes. All in all, the sequence is about 15 minutes long, making it the longest pre-credit action sequence of the entire franchise. But that said, it is an amazing sequence, and I think it is one of the best in the entire franchise. However, there is an interesting controversy about this, because you see, in the screenplay for The World Is Not Enough, the boat chase on the Thames was part of the pre-credit action sequence.
What?
So what gives? Well, either director Michael Apted is seriously misremembering, or he must have actually made the change himself to buff up the boat chase and add it after the credits, only to reinsert it back to the pre-credits. So we are still in the pre-credit action sequence when Bond goes to the MI6 building and he flirts with Moneypenny. And I love this scene because I love the dynamic between Pierce Brosnan and Samantha Bond, which brings back the electric chemistry between Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell. And then we learn that M is an old friend of Robert King. And Robert King thanks Bond for retrieving the money, and he heads home with it. But whoever stole the money, the villain, has created an improvised explosive device known as an IED, often called a fertilizer bomb. And the money itself was the bomb, because the cash was dipped in urea, which is heavy in nitrogen similar to ammonium nitrate, and it was dried and put in the briefcase. And Bond, who handled the cash, now has urea on his fingertips. And then when he touches the ice, which is water, because when urea and water mix, it creates an endothermic reaction that cools the surroundings. This alerts Bond to the fact that there was something suspicious about the money. He runs to Robert King to prevent him from touching the money. However, it is too late. The lapel on Robert King electronically detonates a magnesium strip on one of the bills, causing an exothermic reaction that blows up the briefcase full of urea, killing Robert King. And Bond looks out of a hole made by the explosion, and he sees the Cigar Girl, who has a drop on him with an automatic machine gun and almost shoots him. Bond goes to Q Labs and takes Q's new prototype boat.
Stop! You didn't finish!
And this leads to an exciting boat chase on the Thames. This little boat is amazing. It's a tiny one-seater that's fast and agile. And when the Cigar Girl almost gets away due to a dropping bridge, Bond's boat goes underwater, and while underwater, he straightens out his tie. And that has to be one of the most Bond moments of all. And that moment was the idea of Pierce Brosnan. The cigar girl then blocks Bond's path on the Thames, and it looks like she'll get away, but Bond sees a path through a canal that will require him to go some of it on land, which he does, plowing through a fish market, and even goes right through a nice restaurant. And they meet head on, and Bond shoots a torpedo, but the cigar girl is able to get her boat to the coast before the torpedo blows up. And Bond chases the cigar girl to the Millennium Dome, and she steals a hot air balloon. However, Bond jumps on a rope, and the cigar girl can't quite shoot him, but she sees that the police have arrived, and she'll be captured, and she can't be captured. But Bond offers protection to the cigar girl, but she chooses to commit suicide by blowing up the balloon rather than be taken by the police. Bond falls off the hot air balloon and onto the Millennium Dome, where he injures his shoulder, and there's a scene where he rolls and he was supposed to catch himself on the wires but misses, and this was not intentional. The stuntman really just actually missed the wires and continued to roll down, and the shot looked so good and looked so dangerous, because it was dangerous, that Michael Apted chose to use it in the print of the movie. And thus ends one of the most action-packed sequences in the history of the franchise. And this entire scene is a heart-pounding, jaw-dropping action sequence that ranks as one of the best in the Bond movies. And the entire sequence took 7 weeks to film. And for the longest time, it was the longest pre-credit action sequence until 2021, when No Time to Die's pre-credit action sequence clocked in at 20 minutes. For the movie end credits, the visual theme is oil, since this is going to be a movie about oil and pipelines. And it was created by Daniel Kleinman, who did the visuals for GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. And the visual montage starts with James Bond, who's injured his shoulder by falling on top of the Millennium Dome, slowly getting up and clutching his shoulder, knowing that he's really injured it. And it's a nice continuation from the opening pre-credit action sequence to the music montage. The song was performed by Garbage, and I don't know much about this group, but the song is okay. It's not one of the best songs of Bond, but it's not a bad song. I'd say it's adequate. It is good enough. And David Arnold returns for the musical score, and this time, in all the songs, David Arnold heavily relied on the Monty Norman James Bond theme, plus all of its variations, to inform the musical score of the movie. And then we start the movie proper. We go to Robert King's funeral, and we're introduced to Electra King, who is strikingly beautiful, and Bond becomes fascinated by her. And since the MI6 office has been compromised, they go to their backup secret headquarters in Scotland. And this is the Eileen Donan Castle that was also used in the movie Highlander. And in the office, behind our M, played by Dame Judi Dench, you can see a painting of the Bernard Lee M, aka Miles Messervy. And M briefs all the double O's in a scene reminiscent of Thunderball. And like Thunderball, there is actually a female 00 agent. M vows to bring justice to whoever killed Robert King. And when all the other 00s get their mission brief, Bond doesn't get one, since he's not been medically cleared due to his shoulder injury. So Bond seduces and manipulates the female doctor to medically clear him before the shoulder has fully healed. And Bond visits Q, and we learn that the Q boat was actually Q's fishing boat that he was working on for his retirement.
My fishing boat. For my retirement.
Now, in the last movie, Tomorrow Never Dies, they actually considered filming this little goodbye scene. However, they were certain that Desmond Llewellyn could return for one more movie, and so they held off until this film. And here, it's a very touching moment where Desmond Llewellyn actually gets to say goodbye and gets a really nice send-off. And we meet his new assistant, played by John Cleese, who plays a comedic bumbling role. And I am a huge John Cleese fan. Monty Python, Fawlty Towers are two of my favorite pieces of entertainment. And A Fish Called Wanda is one of my favorite 80s movies. So if you told me that John Cleese was going to replace Q in the James Bond movies, I would have bet anything that it would have been gold. But now that we have him here, I don't think it really works. And I think the reason why is that Q was so funny because he was not a comedian. We laughed because Q was genuinely frustrated with Bond, and we felt it with him. But when you cast a real comedian, one of the best comedians of all time, I wonder if it undermines what made Q so charming. Well, this scene really ended up being Desmond Llewellyn's sign-off, and it's a very touching moment, because it would be the last time Desmond Llewellyn plays Q after playing him in 17 movies, 5 different James Bond actors, 3 M actors, 3 Moneypenny actresses and had been there ever since from Russia with Love. And he'd become a James Bond staple. And so Q says, I've always tried to teach you 2 things.
First, never let them see you bleed.
And the second?
Always have an escape plan.
And it's such a great, touching moment. However, after shooting this scene, the filmmakers, as Desmond Llewellyn himself, actually believed that he might be able to do one more movie after this. So they thought maybe they'll hold on to this scene or just put it in anyway. But suddenly, about 3 weeks after filming had wrapped, Desmond Llewellyn was at a convention signing autographs, and while driving home, he got into a car accident and died in that accident. And I'll talk a little more about the details of that accident later in this video. Now, Bond begins to research Elektra King, and he learns that she had been kidnapped as a child, and he starts to feel a sympathy for her. He begins to feel a connection. And he learns that the money he retrieved for Robert King was about £3 million, and when exchanged into US dollars equals exactly $5 million, the exact amount of the kidnapping ransom. And he deduces that there must be a connection and that the kidnapper, Renard, must be back. Bond discovers that Elektra's file is locked, and only M would have the ability to do that. So Bond confronts her, and she reveals that when Elektra was kidnapped, Robert King wanted to pay the kidnappers the $5 million ransom, but M suggested that he not pay them, knowing that this would lead to Elektra being tortured longer. We also learn the supervillain origins of Renard from the MI6 doctor who was in an unprofessional relationship with Bond and cleared him early. And she tells us that during the time of the kidnapping, M sent 009 after him, and 009 put a bullet in Renard's head. But it didn't kill him, but rather damaged his brain.
It's moving through the medulla oblongata, killing off his senses.
The medulla oblongata.
So that he doesn't feel pain and he has no senses. And he only grows stronger until the bullet will eventually kill him. So, okay, I'm not quite sure I know what that medical condition is, but I'll go with it. M and Bond assume that Renard may be going after Elektra King once again, and so Bond is sent to protect her. And Bond goes to Azerbaijan to meet up with Elektra King and tells her that she may be in danger, but she refuses his help. Bond is insistent, but Elektra just doesn't feel that she needs his protection. And in Azerbaijan, we get the return of Universal Exports, which is the cover identity of MI6 and was created by Ian Fleming and first appeared in his second novel, Live and Let Die. Now, one of the criticisms of this movie were the lackluster exotic locales, because the James Bond franchise has taken us to some beautiful and exotic and impressive locales in the past. And this location here, the oil fields of Azerbaijan, as well as a nuclear site in Kazakhstan, later in the movie, really seems less impressive. Well, the screenwriters Neil Purvis and Robert Wade actually had a reason for doing this, and it's actually pretty interesting, because in the 1960s, the James Bond franchise was known for their exotic locations, which could take an audience to places they had never seen before. For example, in 1967, You Only Live Twice took Americans and British audiences to Japan, a place most Americans had never really seen. And this is because there was not much world traveling in the 1960s. Well, in 1999, world traveling to exotic places like Japan and India had become so common that the writers wanted to take the audience to places that they'd definitely never seen before. Places like Baku, Azerbaijan, and the Bosphorus River in Istanbul. And as you can see, these are very beautiful cities. And they also wanted to show the dreary oil fields of Azerbaijan and the leftover nuclear sites of Kazakhstan. But the crew decided not to film there. And in fact, this scene was actually filmed in Spain, which filled in for both the oil fields of Azerbaijan and the abandoned Soviet nuclear facility in Kazakhstan. Oh well. However, Baku, Azerbaijan and the Bosphorus River in Istanbul are real. In Azerbaijan, we see Elektra has taken over her father's company and is extending the pipelines, but she also has a heart of gold. And the character of Elektra King is half British and half Azerbaijani. English oil magnate Robert King married a local Azerbaijani woman, and they had Elektra King. And when the locals riot to prevent the pipeline from going through their town, Elektra meets with the town clergy and offers to save the town and build the pipeline around their village, despite it costing them millions. It wins her over to us, and we feel that she has a conscience and a strong moral code, even though we'll later learn that we'll be wrong. Now Bond sees us, and he is immediately impressed with her. And Bond tells her that she may be in danger, but she refuses his help once again. And Elektra reminds Bond that she has many enemies, including 3 Russian competitors who are all trying to kill her. But Bond is insistent, but again, Elektra just doesn't feel she needs MI6's protection. And we begin to wonder if Elektra King may have a death wish. And we'll learn later in the movie how much that's true.
You'll be safe here.
I don't want to be safe.
And in the background in Azerbaijan, we see these helicopters with 5 blades underneath them. And these are meant to cut trees. These will appear later when they're used as weapons that destroy Zukovsky's caviar factory. And in case you're wondering if these are real, no, they're not. They actually were designed as weapons, specifically for this movie. Later, the two go skiing in order to inspect the pipelines of Azerbaijan in the mountains. And incidentally, this was not filmed in Azerbaijan, but rather filmed in Chamonix, France. Later, the two go skiing, and Elektra's outfit evokes Tracy Bond's ski outfit in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And the idea is for us to similarly root for this love story between Bond and Elektra, only to be shocked later and have the rug pulled out from underneath us when we discover that she was the villain. And I remember when it was revealed that Elektra King was the villain, I was genuinely surprised because it just came out of nowhere, and I loved it. What about you? Were you surprised by the reveal? Let me know in the comments below. And as Bond and Elektra ski, a group of parasailing snowmobiles try to kill them. And as Bond skis, 4 Parahawks appear. And it's a cool action sequence, and it's very different. So Bond lures the 4 Parahawks into the trees, where he gets 2 of them to crash into the trees and causes the other 2 to crash into each other by skiing over one of them, ripping their parachute, causing him to lose control, crashing into the final Parahawk. And when this causes an avalanche, Bond uses the inflatable ball, and while encased in the ball, Elektra has a flashback that causes a mental decompensation. And we see that Bond is concerned and is genuinely starting to care for her. We will later learn that Renard has sent these Parahawks in order to kill Bond. Elektra tries to seduce Bond, but Bond puts his duty first to M, and he refuses, at least for now. Bond visits his old friend, KGB-turned-gangster, Valentin Zukovsky, who now runs a legitimate casino. And he's played by Robbie Coltrane, better known as Hagrid in the Harry Potter series, in reprising his role once again since GoldenEye, now channeling Rick in Casablanca. And Bond tries to get information on who those hitmen were. And here Bond uses his X-ray glasses. And if you were a little kid in the 1970s, you remember every comic book advertised X-ray glasses for $1.49. And they claim to let you be able to see through people's clothes and see the skeleton on your fingers. And if you ever bought them, they were, of course, a complete scam. But well, James Bond fulfills our 9-year-old's wish by having real X-ray specs. And then we get one of those really cool James Bond moments when he orders a drink and a bouncer tries to manhandle him. The bouncer approaches to rough him up, and he knocks the bouncer down, grabs the bouncer's own knife, uses the knife to pin him down, and then takes the bouncer's own gun and slowly and calmly hands it to the bartender and calmly sips his vodka martini.
Shaken, not stirred.
Such a great moment. Bond is taken to Zukovsky, where he tells Bond that there are 3 rival oil companies that are competing with Elektra King. And then suddenly, Elektra walks into the casino, and she plays a game of high card draw for $1 million. And Bond is very concerned for her and even tries to help by having the dealer burn the top 3 cards. She draws a queen, but Zukovsky draws an ace. An ace of clubs, which is a little on the nose. And it's a weird scene, but Bond now feels that something just isn't right. So Elektra tries to seduce Bond once again, and Bond refuses once again. So good for you, Mr. Bond. And then in a few minutes, Bond and Elektra make love.
Finally!
Meanwhile, we learn that Elektra's head of security, Davidoff, is working for Renard. And almost halfway through the movie, we finally meet the main villain, 48 minutes into the film. And Robert Carlyle is almost unrecognizable as Renard. And he's angry at Davidoff and Dr. Mikhail Arkhov for failing to kill Bond with the Parahawks. And we see that he can't feel pain, and when he punishes Davidoff for not killing Bond, he picks up a hot coal, and Renard clearly can't feel it, and makes Davidoff hold it, although it doesn't really explain why Renard's skin just isn't burnt right off the bone. Arkoff blames Davidoff for the failure, but Renard kills him instead of Davidoff, and they throw his body into the trunk of Davidoff's car. Bond exchanges himself with the body of Arkoff, and when Davidoff opens the trunk to grab Arkoff's body, Bond shoots him and kills him. And Renard's men escape Bond for Dr. Mikhail Arkoff, and they take him on the plane to Kazakhstan. And in Kazakhstan, an international team is disarming an old Soviet arsenal of nuclear missiles. However, Renard and his team plan to go there and steal a nuclear missile for their own nefarious purposes. And in Kazakhstan, Bond poses as Arkoff, and we meet Christmas Jones, the nuclear physicist played by Denise Richards, who is there working for the international team. Bond then comes face to face with the main villain Renard, who reveals that it was indeed he who spared his life at the beginning of the movie, so that he could deliver the money to Robert King. Now Bond has a drop on Renard, who says,
"There's no point living if you can't feel alive."
Which Bond remembers Elektra saying.
There's no point in living if you can't feel alive.
And this is the second clue that something strange is going on with Renard and Elektra. Now Christmas Jones comes in with military security because she has discovered that Bond is an imposter and that the real Dr. Arkoff is a 63-year-old fat guy. Of course, we know that Arkoff was working for Renard and that Renard had killed him earlier. Renard kills the military security and escapes with one of the missiles. And then we get a cool 007 moment as Bond uses an Omega watch as a grappling gun and then dives through the door as it closes, all in hot pursuit of Renard and a nuclear missile. And it's peak Bond. He takes out many of Renard's goons, but Renard manages to escape with the missile, leaving a bomb with a 5-second detonation. And Christmas Jones seals the door, and Bond barely gets through, but singes his back. And during the stuntman actually did burn the back of his jacket. Bond and Christmas make it out, and I love how Bond introduces himself. He says,
"Name's Bond."
And then the lift takes him up, and he finishes,
"James Bond."
And the two barely escape the explosion. Elektra calls M and says that Bond is missing, and plays the innocent victim and convinces M to come to Azerbaijan to help her. M arrives at Azerbaijan to help Elektra, but Bond has arrived as well and confronts Elektra about working with Renard, which she denies. And Bond tells M that he suspects Elektra as the inside man, but of course M just can't believe it. And Elektra is able to convince Bond that Renard is the real villain and that he has planted a plutonium bomb in one of her pipelines. Bond and Christmas go to defuse the bomb, but they're too late. They take a pig, aka a pipeline inspection gauge, which can maintain pipelines without stopping the flow of oil, and they ride it at high speed, reminiscent of a roller coaster ride. In fact, the last time we saw the pig was in the beginning of The Living Daylights. Bond and Christmas get on the pig with the bomb, but they realize that someone has tampered with it, and half the plutonium is missing. And they let the bomb explode, and sure enough, it is a dud. It wasn't nuclear. Elektra assumes that Bond is dead, and then Elektra reveals to M that she is indeed working with Renard, and that it was she that killed her own father, Robert King. She still has a grudge against M for convincing her father not to pay the ransom when she was kidnapped, and for using her as bait for MI6 to capture Renard. And she kills M's bodyguards and takes M prisoner. And then Elektra pulls a Michael Corleone by destroying the competing pipelines. And we learn that Renard and Elektra are lovers, and they abduct M and keep her locked up, just as Elektra was locked up when she was kidnapped in her youth. Bond and Christmas go to Istanbul, Turkey, and they go to Zukovsky's caviar factory. However, one of Zukovsky's men, Mr. Bullion, aka Bull, get it? He has gold bullion in his teeth, and Mr. Bullion is played by Clifford Price, aka Goldie. And Mr. Bullion is working for Renard and Elektra. And Bond asks Zukovsky why Elektra gave him $1 million payoff. And Zukovsky informs him that it was a payoff for the use of an old Soviet submarine that Zukovsky owns that is piloted by his own nephew. And Elektra sends a helicopter with 5 buzzsaws after Bond. And Bond gets inside his BMW and uses its missiles to destroy the helicopter, but then there's a second helicopter with buzzsaws which cuts Bond's BMW in half. It's so sad to see such a beautiful car like the BMW literally cut in half. But then Bond blows up the helicopter, but before it destroys Zukovsky's caviar factory. And Bond, Christmas, and Zukovsky learn that Elektra plans to use the plutonium and use the submarine's nuclear reactor to cause a nuclear meltdown and use it to destroy Istanbul. And with Istanbul destroyed, along with her other competitors' pipelines, which all run through Istanbul, Elektra's pipeline, which was the only pipeline that went around Istanbul, would significantly increase in value. And this plot is an homage to Goldfinger's plan to destroy Fort Knox, making his own gold supply increase in value, as well as Max Zorin's plot to destroy Silicon Valley, increasing the value of his own microchips. In her cell, M uses a battery and uses it to activate her GPS locator to send Bond her exact location, which is at Maiden's Tower. But Goldie betrays Zukovsky, plants a bomb, and captures Bond and Christmas and brings them to Renard. However, Zukovsky actually will use the location sent by M to rescue Bond. Renard commandeers a submarine, murders the crew, and throws them overboard, which includes Zukovsky's nephew. Renard then says goodbye to Elektra because a nuclear meltdown is a suicide mission. Christmas Jones is taken to Renard on the submarine, and Bond is taken to Maiden's Tower, where he'll be tortured by Elektra. And Elektra tells Bond,
I could have given you the world.
And Bond says,
the world is not enough.
And then he tells her it's a family motto. Elektra hooks Bond up to a garrote and begins to choke him, and this is really painful. Brosnan really nails how painful it must be. But Zukovsky finds the location M sent Bond, and he goes to rescue 007. And Zukovsky kills his henchman, Mr. Bouillon, who betrayed him. And Zukovsky tries to rescue his nephew, but Elektra shoots Zukovsky, who, with his last dying breath, shoots the arm brace off Bond, freeing him. Oh man, and this is why Zukovsky is one of my favorite Bond allies. And I really wish that it turned out that he survives to return in the next movie, because he is so awesome. And he's almost as much of a hero of this movie as Bond is. Hashtag justice for Zukovsky. Bond is now free, and Elektra runs up the tower, and Bond goes after her. And he sees M in a cell, and he frees her. Bond has the drop on Elektra, but she gives her an innocent look and almost wins Bond over. But when Elektra orders her men to kill him, Bond shoots Elektra in cold blood. And the scene echoes Bond's shooting of Dr. Kaufman in Tomorrow Never Dies, giving both movies an interesting symmetry. And M arrives just in time to see Bond kill Elektra. What a cold-blooded but incredible scene. Bond dives off the tower and infiltrates Renard's submarine, and he makes it in just before the submarine dives. And Bond kills several of Renard's goons and causes the submarine to dive straight into the bottom of the sea, which causes a leak of seawater into the sub. And Bond makes it to Renard, who is about to trigger the meltdown, but Bond and Renard fight, and Renard almost has the upper hand, but Bond tells him that he just killed Elektra, and Renard loses it. And he almost causes a meltdown, but Bond kills him by penetrating his body with the plutonium rod. And Bond and Christmas escape Renard's submarine just before it explodes. James Bond and Christmas Jones clean up, and it's New Year's Eve 1999, and the two celebrate the ringing of the new millennium in Turkey. And this is a nice scene to end the movie, with fireworks. M, Moneypenny, Chief of Staff Bill Tanner, and Deputy Chief of Staff are in the MI6 secret office at the Scotland Castle safe house, and R locates Bond's heat signature with a satellite. However, at first they only see Bond, but then realizes that there's actually two people. And then we get the final line of the movie, which is arguably the worst groaner in the entire Bond franchise, and it's so bad that I'm not even going to repeat it here. So thus ends a really great Bond film. And I remember this movie having mixed reviews when it came out, but I absolutely love this movie. And time has been a little kinder to this film, as with all Pierce Brosnan films. And sadly, this film also marks the end of an era. This is the last film where Desmond Llewellyn will play Q. Desmond Llewellyn starred in 17 Bond films from 1963, From Russia with Love, all the way to the present to this film. In fact, the only movie he wasn't in was Live and Let Die. And he's been in more 007 films than any other single actor. Now, Desmond Llewellyn was 85 years old during the filming of The World Is Not Enough, and in this film, he alludes to his retirement by introducing his new assistant R, played by John Cleese, but in actuality, Desmond Llewellyn was not planning to retire from the film and was just setting up his retirement for the future, just in case his health didn't allow him to continue in the future, or EM producers did not let him be in any more films. However, after filming the scene, Llewellyn felt that he was in good health, he felt great, he felt strong, and he stated in interviews that he felt he could be in maybe one or maybe two more Bond movies. And it was realistic that he can do at least one, and pretty reasonable that he could do two. Unfortunately, 2 weeks after the premiere of this film, he was in a head-on collision and died from injuries of that accident. And investigations were conducted, and it was judged to be an accident. Apparently he was on a small road, and he was passing another car on the small road and smashed into an oncoming car. And the passenger of the car that he smashed into had a lot of injuries and almost died, but eventually ended up surviving the accident. So during the video release, they dedicated the movie to Desmond Llewellyn. The World Is Not Enough had its world premiere, not in England, but in Los Angeles on November 8, 1999, and it is only the third James Bond movie to premiere outside of England. The premiere was held at the Fox Bruin Theater in Westwood, Los Angeles, which is the typical standard Hollywood movie location, but very uncommon for a Bond film. Well, The World Is Not Enough did very well at the box office, made on a budget of $136 million. $100 million of it was from product placement, costing the filmmakers only $36 million, although of course there are marketing costs. It ended up raking $126 million in the US and then went on to make $362 million worldwide and became the highest grossing Bond film at the time, unadjusted for inflation. Again, adjusted for inflation, it was still Thunderball. The film was nominated for a Saturn Award for Best Action, Adventure, and Thriller. Pierce Brosnan won both the Empire Award and the Blockbuster Entertainment Award as Best Actor, and David Arnold won the BMI Film Music Award for his score on this movie. But the movie did receive mixed reviews, and while everyone thought Pierce Brosnan was in top form as James Bond and praised the action sequences, most critics did not like the writing of the script and slammed the paint-by-numbers story, while many critics praised Sophie Marceau's performance. And Roger Ebert said that the film was a splendid comic thriller, exciting and graceful and endlessly invented, and gave it 3.5 stars out of 4 stars, and gave a huge thumbs up. And he also praised Denise Richards' performance, calling her first rate. However, not all critics love Denise Richards' performance, and she has been panned and is often considered one of the lower-tiered Bond girls. And I actually think it's unfair, because it's become cliche to make fun of her, that she's not a believable physicist. Denise Richards did become the first Bond series to win a Golden Raspberry Award when Denise Richards was chosen as Worst Supporting Actress at the 1999 Razzie Awards. But Richards and Brosnan were also nominated for Worst Screen Couple, but lost to Will Smith and Kevin Kline for Wild Wild West. And today, this does remain a controversial Bond film, and it is generally considered one of the lower-tiered Bond films. MSN ranks it as the 3rd worst Bond film in the entire franchise, and Entertainment Weekly ranks it as the 5th worst Bond film. Rolling Stone magazine also ranks it as their 5th worst Bond film. And Forbes is probably the kindest, ranking it in the middle, number 15 out of 23. As for me, I find this a thoroughly enjoyable Bond film and a seminal movie in the history of the James Bond lore. So I'm curious, what did you think of The World Is Not Enough? Please let me know in the comments below. So that ends this video on The World Is Not Enough. How do you rank this movie in the pantheon of James Bond films? And if you enjoyed this video, check out my other videos on other James Bond movies, on the Star Trek films, on Star Wars, and comedies like Popeye and Airplane. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. In this video, we're going to talk about the 2002 Die Another Day, the movie where Bond teams up with Halle Berry, the movie where the villain Gustav Graves turns out to be a North Korean soldier, and his henchman has white skin, blue eyes, and diamonds embedded in his face reminiscent of Mr. Freeze in Batman, the movie where Bond parasurfs a tsunami and totally nails it, and where Bond drives a car that can turn invisible. And this is a film where the main antagonist wears a robotic suit that shoots lightning. I saw this movie on opening night way back in 2002, and I really liked it. I thought it was fun, I thought it was cool, and it was Pierce Brosnan giving an exceptional performance as 007. And this is weird to say today, but at that time, this was my favorite Pierce Brosnan James Bond film.
What?
And this is really embarrassing to say today, but in 2002, I actually liked this movie a little bit better than GoldenEye, which of course seems ridiculous today. Today, I think GoldenEye is a much, much better film. But when I saw Die Another Day, I was fully on board with Pierce Brosnan doing another 3 or 4 Bond movies. And today it's become fashionable to completely hate on this movie, but I'm not really going to do that because I actually still like this film. Although I can recognize that many of the elements do not hold up today, and there are flaws, which I will point out. So I want to talk about what I loved about this movie, and then I'll talk about what I think does not hold up today. First, I thought Pierce Brosnan was excellent in this. He was great in all 3 of his Bond films, but still I think this is his best performance. He's completely settled in the role of Bond, and I was aware that Pierce Brosnan had a 4-picture contract, and his contract was up for renegotiation after this film, and I remember really hoping that they were going to make more films with him. Second, it had an excellent Bond girl in Halle Berry, who was at the height of her powers, having just won an Academy Award in 2001 for Monster Ball. She was Storm in the X-Men, and this was 2 years before she would star as Catwoman. Now this was peak Halle Berry, and she's excellent here. She is so gorgeous and so sexy, and like Wai Lin in Tomorrow Never Dies, I really believed her as a fellow secret agent having her own adventure that happens to intersect with Bond's. And plus, Halle Berry had excellent chemistry with Pierce Brosnan. As for the other Bond girl, Rosamund Pike, I thought she stole the show as Miranda Frost. And this is one of her first movie roles, but you can definitely see her instantly becoming a superstar. I actually thought this had a pretty good story. It was fun, it had a breezy plot, and it was just fun to watch. And fifth, this movie had a worthy villain in Gustav Graves. Yes, it is completely ridiculous that he turns out to be a North Korean officer, but you have to admit, on his own, Gustav Graves is an excellent Bond villain. He is James Bond's opposite number in the business world, and he's a worthy adversary to 007. Plus, it had excellent action sequences, the hovercraft fight at the beginning of the film, the lasers at the medical lab, Bond and Gustav Graves fencing, the car chase scene at the ice fortress. These are all excellent action sequences worthy of the best of Bond. Just don't judge it by the scene where Bond parasails that tsunami. Okay, well let's talk about what does not hold up. And first, it is the overuse of CGI. That fast zoom cuts combined with sudden slow motion, creating a very distracting visual effect. You can feel the filmmakers excited to use and overuse this awesome new technology. And Bond parasailing the tsunami is a symptom of this. And we have to remember that this was 2002 and CGI was just breaking out with broad use in Hollywood. The fast zoom cuts with sudden slow motion definitely ages this film in the early 2000s. This was the very distinct style of the time and used quite frequently in films like XXX and the early Fast and Furious films, Zack Snyder's 300, and John Woo's Mission Impossible 2. So personally, I don't hate on it as much as I see it as a time capsule of the filmmaking of the time. Because in 1999, only 3 years earlier, George Lucas had created Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, which showed that actors could fully interact with legions of computerized actors. And in 2002, George Lucas released Star Wars Episode II, The Attack of the Clones, which showed that CGI could fully create digitized worlds. It was a time when filmmakers saw CGI as the miracle answer to all filmmakers' problems. So in 2002, using CGI to augment the action of a James Bond movie was only seen as a good thing. And in interviews, you can see Lee Tamohori's excitement at how CGI could only improve his 007 movie. But oh, how the times would change. Now, another critique of this film is that it is way too campy. Because there really are two types of James Bond films, the serious and grounded ones like For Your Eyes Only, The Living Daylights, License to Kill, From Russia with Love, and quintessentially the 2006 Casino Royale with Daniel Craig. I think Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough were fairly realistic and grounded. But then there are the campy and cheeky ones like Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, Live and Let Die, The Spy Who Loved Me, Octopussy, Spectre, and Diamonds Are Forever. And after making two fairly grounded and realistic Bond films with Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough, I think that this was Eon's attempt to do something very different and to do a full-on campy Pierce Brosnan film. After all, the main villain is a North Korean who poses as a Caucasian billionaire. And the henchman is a North Korean with bluish white skin and diamonds embedded in his face. Right? That's campy. So after the box office success of The World Is Not Enough, the next film was immediately greenlit. And this was going to be the 20th film in the James Bond franchise, and it would normally be set for a 2001 release. However, 2002 was the 40th anniversary of James Bond since he first appeared in 1962 in Dr. No. Therefore, Eon decided to delay the movie by 1 year, and they hoped that this would give them more time to create an even better James Bond movie. They immediately offered the directing job to Michael Apted, who had directed the last film, The World Is Not Enough, which was a huge financial success. And Michael Apted accepted. But then Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson rescinded the offer so that they could offer the job to Tony Scott, who is best known for directing the 1986 Top Gun, but also Beverly Hills Cop Part 2, The Last Boy Scout, True Romance, and Crimson Tide. So you can kind of see Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson's vision for this movie. However, Tony Scott turned it down. They then offered the job to legendary Hong Kong director John Woo, who had broken into American films with Hard Target, Broken Arrow, and Face Off, and the Tom Cruise vehicle Mission Impossible 2, which was essentially a James Bond movie. However, John Woo declined. And then there was a rumor that Quentin Tarantino was asked to direct, but this appears to be a complete rumor. Michael G. Wilson has adamantly denied that Tarantino was being considered for Bond 20. So apparently, Tarantino was not contacted for Bond 20, but was contacted for the next film, Bond 21, but that's another story. For director, they considered Brett Ratner, and Brett Ratner, who would direct the Rush Hour series with Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker, and who had directed X-Men 3, The Last Stand. Now, Pierce Brosnan really liked this idea and lobbied hard for Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson to hire him. However, Brett Ratner was an American, and in the end, the Broccoli's wanted a British director for the Bond films. Now keep in mind, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson are Americans. They're from New Jersey. So the decision to keep the Bond director part of the British Empire was purely for integrity reasons, and you have to respect that. But the truth may be that Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson just didn't care for a lot of Brett Ratner's work, and that's why they didn't hire him. But Pierce Brosnan and Brett Ratner would eventually get to work together 2 years later on a movie called After the Sunset. Another director considered was Stuart Baird, and Stuart Baird was a well-respected editor, arguably the best editor in Hollywood. However, he wanted to break into directing, and the two jobs he was considered for was this film and Star Trek Nemesis, which he ended up directing. Finally, Lee Tamohori was officially hired to direct this movie. And Lee Tamohori directed the classic Once We Were Warriors, the 1997 film The Edge, and the 2001 Alex Cross thriller Along Came a Spider. And Lee Tamohori, who was a New Zealander, was very committed in making the best James Bond movie of all time, the ultimate James Bond movie, the culmination of the entire 007 franchise. And he wanted to pull out all stops and go all out in this movie. And you can kind of see that in the way he directed this film. And Lee Tamohori actually had a very interesting idea for something he wanted to put into this movie. Now, we're all aware of the debate whether James Bond, as played by the 5 different actors, are really one person, or whether 007 James Bond is just a code name for 5 different people. Lee Tamohori believed that James Bond was a code name for 5 different people and really wanted to firmly establish that theory into the James Bond canon. And he had the idea that Pierce Brosnan's 007 James Bond would meet the old aging Sean Connery's 007 James Bond. However, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson vetoed it immediately. I think there's something to be said for keeping that theory a mystery. Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson had Halle Berry in mind for the role of Jinx, and they offered her the role of Jinx Johnson without an audition, and Halle Berry, being a fan of the James Bond franchise, accepted the role. Now, Halle Berry was born August 14, 1966 in Cleveland, Ohio, and her mother was a psychiatric nurse, and her father was an abusive bus driver who was physically violent to her mother, and Halle Berry grew up witnessing a lot of this abuse. He left them when Halle was 4 years old, and Halle Berry was raised solely by her mother and had been estranged from her father since childhood and had no idea if he was alive or dead. Halle Berry studied hard in school and was an honor student, a cheerleader, and the prom queen. And after high school, she attended Cuyahoga Community College while working at Higbee's department store. And at 18, she entered several beauty contests. She won Miss Teen All-American in 1985 and Miss Ohio USA in 1986. And in 1986, she was Miss USA first runner-up. In 1986, at the age of 20, Halle Berry became the first African-American woman to represent the United States at the Miss World Beauty pageant, where she placed 6th. She then moved to New York to pursue acting, but was so broke she even stayed at a homeless shelter at the YMCA. Halle Berry's first big break came when she was cast in a sitcom show called Living Dolls, which was a spin-off show of Who's the Boss, and starred Leah Remini as a friend of Samantha Michelli's, who was trying to break into a modeling career. And while it lasted only 1 season, this gave Halle Berry some exposure, which she landed a small role in the 1991 Spike Lee's Jungle Fever. But her breakout role was as Eddie Murphy's love interest in the 1992 romantic comedy Boomerang. She got notable roles in the Flintstones movie, Losing Isaiah, Executive Decision, and Bulworth. And in 1999, she starred in Introducing Dorothy Dandridge, where she played Dorothy Dandridge and became the first African-American woman to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. By 2000, she had broken through as an international superstar. She was cast as Storm in the 2000 X-Men movie and in the 2001 Swordfish, and in 2001, she became the first African-American woman to win an Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in Monsters Ball. And in 2002, she was cast in this movie, and in 2003, she was named number 1 in FHM's 100 Sexiest Women in the World. And to this day, she continues to be one of the greatest actresses in the history of cinema. And another actress I really liked was Rosamund Pike, who played Miranda Frost. And this was her first feature film, but her career is going to take off from here after this movie, and she's going to be in over 100 movies. Rosamund Pike was born in Hammersmith, London, and was the only child of 2 opera singers, and she studied literature at Oxford. And while a student at Oxford, she made appearances on the British television shows A Rather English Marriage, Wives and Daughters, and Love in a Cold Climate. But her big break came when she was cast as Miranda Frost in this movie. Die Another Day was her very first movie role, and she is the first actress to star as a Bond girl to have graduated from Oxford. The second is Léa Seydoux, who played Madeline Swan, who also attended Oxford. Rosamund Pike then starred in The Libertine with Johnny Depp and was in the video game movie Doom. In 2010, she narrated the James Bond audiobook The Spy Who Loved Me, and she voiced Pussy Galore in the BBC radio adaptation of Goldfinger. And in 2011, she played Kate Summer in the Bond spoof film Johnny English Reborn. She played Andromeda in The Wrath of the Titans, she starred in The World's End, and in Jack Reacher. And then she blew away critics and audiences in the 2014 David Fincher film Gone Girl. And I think she really shows her potential here as a future superstar. And while filming this movie, she actually was still a student at Oxford and had to leave one day for her graduation. The screenplay for Die Another Day was written by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who also wrote the last film, The World Is Not Enough, and from here would go on to write the 2006 Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die. And since this was the 20th Bond film, also celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Eon Bond series, producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson really wanted to lean into this. And one of the things they wanted was, as part of the 40th anniversary, was to have direct homages to all 19 of the previous James Bond movies. So in fact, in this movie, John Cleese's Q tells Bond that this is the 20th watch he's given to Bond.
Now, new watch. This will be your 20th, I believe.
And there's some other references, some obvious, some more subtle. And it's fun to watch this movie and try to locate as much of them as you can. For example, obviously Jinx's introduction when she comes out of the water is an homage to Honey Rider in Dr. No. When Gustav Graves jumps out of the airplane and has a full Union Jack parachute, that's a reference to The Spy Who Loved Me. In Q's laboratory, we get almost every gadget used in the past Bond films. We have Rosa Kleb's knife boot from Russia with Love, as well as a briefcase. We get the jetpack from Thunderball. In the background on the wall, you can see the submarine crocodile from Octopussy. And we also get the elevating climbing rope that we saw in Octopussy. And we also saw on the shelf beneath the crocodile, you can actually see Little Nellie from You Only Live Twice. And those are the ones I spotted, but I challenge you to go look for others. And tell me if you can spot any more in the comments below. And there are a lot of other references, and I'll try to point them out as we discuss the movie. Now, one of the coolest sets of the movie is the ice fortress of Gustav Graves. And believe it or not, this is actually based on a real place. Producer Barbara Broccoli got the idea when she was reading an in-flight magazine and saw a photo of the ice hotel in Jukkasjärvi, Sweden. And this place really does exist, and sure enough, every summer it melts, so they rebuild it every year, and today it is in its 36th year of operation. and it's gorgeous. You can look it up on Expedia.com, and you can rent a room. Rooms run around $400 to $500 a night, and the hotel was first built in 1989 when Japanese artists visited the area to create exhibitions of art with ice, and they decided to make it an annual event. The next year, in 1990, a French artist held the art exhibition in an igloo, but all the hotels in town were all booked, so many guests of the ice exhibit slept in their igloos in sleeping bags on top of reindeer skins. And they were the first official guests in what would become the Ice Hotel. And for many years, the Ice Hotel really was just ice sculptures that were made and melted and made again based on weather and climate. And it really was an ice hotel. And that's how it was during the filming of this movie. But in 2016, they decided to create a more permanent infrastructure for the hotel so that it could be fully operational all year round. And when Barbara Broccoli saw this in the magazine, she thought, wow, that would look great in a Bond movie. And sure enough, there it is. So like all Bond movies, this film starts out with a classic gun barrel sequence, but they made one change. When Bond shoots our first-person gun barrel, a CGI bullet comes out of his gun and goes inside our gun barrel. And it's different, it's a little odd, and well, let's just say it's no wonder why they never did this again. And it says that we are in Pukchon Coast of North Korea, and there really is a Pukchon Coast, which is a real beach in North Korea, but in reality it is nowhere near the demilitarized zone, and it is more in the middle of the North Korean eastern coastline. So the movie starts out on a shore with big waves, and we see a surfer surfing those huge waves, and then we see another surfer, and then we see a third surfer, and we have 3 surfers surfing these humongous waves. 3 of the top professional surfers at the time, Laird Hamilton, Dave Kalama, and Derek Dorner, were hired for this scene, and interestingly enough, they filmed it on Christmas Day, 2001. And this film was not filmed in North Korea, but was filmed at Jos Peahi in Maui, Hawaii, which is known for its huge and dangerous waves. And when they land on the beach, they take off their surfing wetsuits to reveal completely dry clothing underneath, including a very dry, stylish leather jacket, which is an obvious reference to Goldfinger, where Bond takes off his wetsuit to reveal a white tuxedo. So now we're on the shores of North Korea, but in reality, the moment Bond and his team emerged out of the water, it was actually filmed in Holywell Bay in North Cornwall in the UK. And most of the scenes inside of North Korea were actually filmed on set in Pinewood. Bond then switches identities with an arms dealer who's brought a lot of diamonds and is in there to buy high-tech weapons from Colonel Tan Sun Moon, and Bond secretly plants C4 explosives in the briefcase of diamonds. And when we meet Colonel Moon, he's kickboxing on a sandbag, but it turns out to have a person inside. And that person was apparently his psychotherapist who had the gall to lecture him. So you get the idea of what kind of person Colonel Moon is. We also meet Colonel Moon's second-in-command, Zhao, played by Ricky Yoon. And I really like Ricky Yoon's presence here as a North Korean before he turns into that ridiculous Mr. Freeze-like character. Well, they're about to make the switch, but Zhao gets a mysterious text for someone in the West who reveals that the arms dealer is really James Bond, a British Secret Service. And that means that North Koreans have a mole inside MI6, someone who's helping them. And later we're going to find out that it is Miranda Frost, but at this time it's still very much a mystery. Zhao blows up Bond's plane and it's a huge gunfight, and Bond gets onto a hovercraft and gets away, but he's chased by more hovercrafts. Bond goes through a minefield, which suggests that they're going through the demilitarized zone on the 38th parallel. And for those that don't know, the demilitarized zone is a stretch of land 160 miles wide and 2.5 miles wide that separates North Korea and South Korea. And it has so many mines that human beings almost never enter that area. And as a stretch of land that is over 305 square miles and twice the size of New York City, it has been untouched by human beings for over 70 years. And it is now the home of multiple rare animals and plants and birds that were once thought extinct, but are now thriving because of the lack of any human contact. And I think that is very interesting. Colonel Moon chases Bond over a waterfall, presumably to his death, and Colonel Moon falls over while Bond survives by jumping and grabbing onto a bell. Colonel Moon's father, General Moon, arrives, and seeing that his son has died, he arrests Bond and throws him into a North Korean prison. And as the music montage begins, we see that James Bond is being tortured by the North Koreans. And we get scorpions, we get Women Made of Fire and Women Made of Ice. And these are likely the references to the types of torture that Bond presumably endured during his 14 months of captivity under the North Koreans. But we also have a Woman Made of Ice and a Woman Made of Fire, which can also be a visual reference to Jinx Johnson and Miranda Frost, the two Bond girls of this movie. And the theme of this music montage and the lyrics to the song Die Another Day was supposed to be about how James Bond endured and survived his 14 months of torture. And of course we get Madonna's theme song, which was both popular and panned at the same time. This song was nominated for both a Golden Globe for Best Original Song, but was also nominated for a Golden Raspberry for Worst Original Song. And of course, Madonna was huge in the 1980s and even into the 1990s. And by 2002, she was at the stage of her career where she was 44 years old and married to Guy Ritchie and was having her touring comeback era. So she was still quite relevant during this time in her career. The movie proper starts with Bond, who's been tortured for 14 months, and now he has long hair and a beard, and he's taken outside, and we think he's going to be executed. However, it turns out to be a prisoner exchange, and Bond's being traded for Zhao. And oddly enough, Zhao still has diamonds embedded in his face. And it works great as a visual for the Bond villain, but it really doesn't make sense that the British medical system wouldn't remove the diamonds for him. Not only for medical reasons, but those diamonds are probably worth a lot. Now, M wants to know if Bond gave away any secrets, because apparently someone has been revealing secrets of MI6's missions. We know that this is Miranda Frost, but at this point, M actually thinks it's Bond. But Bond assures her that he didn't. But the North Koreans seem to have information that only Bond could have given them, so M revokes his 00 status. Bond makes an escape off the British transport, which has landed in Hong Kong, and he swims ashore and makes it to his favorite luxury hotel in Hong Kong, and he strides into the lobby with his beard and long flowing hair and hospital pajamas soaking wet from his swim ashore, but still cool and suave as Bond always is. And the hotel is the fictional Rubion Royale Hotel, and the name was an homage. Ruby is the gem for the 40th anniversary, and Eon for Eon Productions. Ruby Yon. And if you're wondering what hotel stood in for the Rubion, there wasn't one. The exterior of the Hong Kong Yacht Club was used for the exterior shots, and the interior of the Rubion Royale Hotel was actually built on set. One of the staff members recognized him, and he takes Bond up to the presidential suite, gives him a lobster dinner and Bollinger's champagne. And he's able to get some new clothes, gets a haircut and a shave, and he's back to the old James Bond that we all know and love, and we get a lot of product placement here. The Chinese Secret Service begin to spy on him, but Bond recognizes one of the staff members.
You think I haven't always known your Chinese intelligence, Chang?
And they talk, and Bond agrees to kill Zhao in exchange for information. And the Chinese Secret Service agent Chang tells him that Zhao has been spotted in Havana. So Bond, who is now officially rogue without his 00 status, heads to Havana for an off-the-books investigation, likely an homage to License to Kill. In Havana, Bond meets up with an old Cuban contact named Raul, who is a sleeper agent in Cuba, who has been a sleeper agent for so long in Cuba that he's almost disoriented, having to work back as an MI6 agent. But Raul tells Bond that Zhao is on a nearby island of Los Organos, where a Dr. Alvarez has a mysterious medical clinic. And Raul hooks Bond up with a gun, some binoculars, a 1947 Ford Fairlane, and Bond heads to find Zhao. And we get some other interesting homages. Bond finds a book on bird watching, Birds of the West Indies by James Bond, and this is the very book that in 1953, James Bond creator Ian Fleming used to name his protagonist. And on the coast, Bond is scoping out the island clinic where he spots a South African bully named Mr. Krug bullying a bunch of locals of Cuba, whom Bond will punish later. And he notices a beautiful woman coming out of the water in an homage to Honey Rider in Dr. No, and there's instant chemistry between the two. And we learn that she is
Jacinta Johnson.
And this immediately leads to an intimate moment. The next morning, Jinx heads to the clinic on the island, and remember the abusive South African bully? Well, Bond goes into his room, knocks him out, throws him onto a wheelchair, and uses him to get on the island, pretending to be his porter. And on the island, the clinic is a gene therapy clinic where patients can alter their appearance by altering their DNA by infusing them with DNA of donors. A process invented by Dr. Alvarez where he tells Jinx that the donors are poor orphan children from the island. So we know that Dr. Alvarez is a pretty evil guy, and Jinx just murders him in cold blood. And Jinx turns out to be a secret agent herself. And while exploring the facility, Bond discovers that Zhao is there to transform himself to resemble a German. But Zhao wakes up, and Bond and Zhao fight. Bond snags Zhao's necklace, which is going to have a diamond in it, but Zhao escapes, and Jinx then tries to kill him as well, but Zhao barely escapes on a helicopter. And this is a great action sequence. And then Bond is totally confused about who Jinx is. And I love that Jinx just gives Bond a little wink before she dives off, like she's having the best James Bond time of her life herself. Because Halle Berry's little wink is the most James Bond move ever. Bond investigates the diamonds and learns that the diamonds are illegal North Korean conflict diamonds that have the stamp of Gustav Graves, a new billionaire that came out of nowhere a year ago who has supposedly discovered a diamond mine in Iceland. And this is the first clue that Gustav Graves is really North Korean Colonel Moon, and that there really is no diamond mine in Iceland. But the diamonds are in fact illegal conflict diamonds from Africa that Colonel Moon purchased earlier. So Bond decides to go back to England to investigate this Gustav Graves. And you see the stewardess here on this airplane? This is Roger Moore's own daughter. And we meet Gustav Graves, a daring, handsome billionaire who skydives into his meeting where he'll be knighted. And this is the Union Jack parachute reference from The Spy Who Loved Me. And Graves is rich, he's suave, he's confident, and apparently has boundless energy and doesn't need to sleep. Although we'll find out that his lack of need for sleep is actually a side effect of the genetic process and is slowly leading him into insanity. James Bond and Gustav Graves have their official introduction at the fencing club, and Graves says,
"Have we met before?"
And this is Graves, who is really Tan Sun Moon, recognizes Bond and is just toying with him. We meet Graves' beautiful publicist Miranda Frost, who is also an MI6 spy sent to keep tabs on Graves, but is in fact a double agent really working for Graves, aka Colonel Moon. And we get a quick cameo from Madonna, who plays a fencing instructor, and it's an odd cameo. You know, the Queen of Pop is the first official singer of a James Bond theme song to actually have a role in the same movie. And I have to admit, I see it now, and Madonna, who was 44 years old at the time, still looks actually pretty good here. James Bond and Graves challenge each other to a duel that progressively escalates from fencing foils to actual swords to samurai swords and then huge broadswords. And it's a fantastic action sequence that sets up Graves, aka Colonel Moon, as a worthy antagonist to James Bond. And for a second, we almost see Graves lose control, but he's able to reel it back in and calmly accepts defeat. Bond wins the duel, and Gustav Graves generously invites Bond to a business presentation in Iceland. And Bond is invited back to MI6, where M proclaims that he is now useful again. And I don't know, does M seem a little cold-blooded to James Bond in this movie? So James Bond visits Q Branch, and once again, we get John Cleese, who has been promoted from R to Q, the quartermaster. And John Cleese is dialing his performance back a little from the last movie, and he does work a little better here than in the last film. And Q-Lab is a treasure trove of references from the past. I mentioned the Rosa Club's knife shoe, the crocodile sub, Little Nelly. Oh, and there's the Acrostar, used in the pre-credit action sequence of Octopussy. And this interaction between Pierce Brosnan and John Cleese actually works pretty well, because it's weird to think that this was going to be the James Bond and Q interaction for the next few films, because they were 100% planning on making more James Bond movies with Pierce Brosnan, and this scene was setting up their new relationship. Q gives James Bond a new watch, and then he gives him a ring that can shatter glass. Two very realistic gadgets. And then he presents Bond with his new car. And this is one of the reasons why this movie gets so much flack. The invisible car. Now first, I do like the fact that they made this car an Aston Martin. Specifically, an Aston Martin V12 Vanquish, which is a beautiful car. It's so beautiful. James Bond had driven a BMW for the past 3 movies, and it's nice to see him return to his old classic car. I also like the fact that they tried to explain the invisibility by saying it's cameras projecting the image from one side to the other. However, I wish that they made the CGI closer to that technology. Instead, they totally created an invisible car that absolutely stretches the imagination, like the Klingon bird of prey from Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. It really is invisible. So we get James Bond driving his car to Gustav Graves' ice fortress in Iceland, and it's important to note that this ice fortress does not exist in Iceland. And I say this because tourism in Iceland increased after this movie due to people wanting to visit the ice fortress. But there's no ice fortress in Iceland. This was based on the Ice Hotel in Sweden, not Iceland. And the ice fortress was a real practical set that was built in 3 different places. The exterior of the ice castle was built in Jökulsárlón, a glacial lagoon in southeast Iceland, while the interior of the ice castle was built on the Pinewood Studio set, and the biodome interiors were filmed at the Eden Project in Cornwall, England. As Bond arrives in the ice castle, he's greeted by another henchman, Mr. Kill, which is rather an on-the-nose villain name. And then we see Gustav Graves arrive in an ice dragster, which will set up Bond, who'll use this same ice dragster for some parasailing. And Jinx Johnson arrives also at the Ice Palace, continuing her investigation of Gustav Graves. And I have to admit, I love the interior of the ice castle. It's a worthy set piece reminiscent of some of the greatest villain lairs like the volcano in You Only Live Twice or Drax's Fortress in Moonraker. Now, during the presentation, Gustav Graves unveils his master plan. A new orbital mirror satellite called the Icarus that can focus a beam of sunlight that can create year-round sunlight to assist in agriculture. Now, incidentally, the original name for the satellite was going to be Solaris, which does make a little more sense. However, earlier that year in 2002, a movie by the name of Solaris opened, the science fiction movie starring George Clooney, and therefore the filmmakers changed the name of the satellite from Solaris to Icarus. As Zhao arrives at the ice fortress, he meets up with Gustav Graves, where we, the audience, learn here that Graves is Colonel Townsend Moon. And Gustav Graves is in what looks like Zhao's genetic therapy machine, but here it's Gustav, or Colonel Moon's, dream machine, which helps him get an hour of deep sleep. And the conceit is that the gene therapy has the side effect of preventing sleep, and so the patients will eventually go insane. However, the dream machine can place the patient in deep sleep for 1 hour a day, thereby delaying the inevitable insanity. Bond spies on Mr. Kill, but is caught by another guard and barely manages to escape with the help of Miranda Frost. Meanwhile, Jinx has tracked down someone using the machine she recognizes as being from Dr. Alvarez's lab in Cuba, but when she sees who it is, it's Zhao, who is actually not asleep but very awake, and from behind, Graves electrocutes her with a power glove, capturing her. Yes, the villain in this movie has a power glove that shoots electricity. Bond swims in to rescue her, and we get the rebreather from Thunderball. Zhao decides to kill Jinx by cutting her with a laser, and of course this is an homage to Goldfinger. And I can see what they were trying to do here. They're probably thinking if one slow laser is that suspenseful, then 6 fast-moving lasers will be 6 times more suspenseful. Well, I don't think that logic holds up in terms of enjoyability, because even here when one laser is headed toward Jinx's head and Bond barely turns it off, it was actually suspenseful and I was worried for Jinx. However, when multiple lasers are whizzing around randomly, cutting Bond and Mr. Kill, it becomes a random visual mess and it lost the suspense of the scene, because sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. And Mr. Kill has a drop on Bond, but Jinx guides a laser and uses it to burn a hole in Mr. Kill's head, and that was brutal. Jinx reveals to Bond that she is an NSA agent, and they try to escape the room, but they need a handprint, and so Jinx decides to use the laser to cut off Mr. Kill's hand. She reveals that she saw the gene therapy machine similar to one that Zhao was using in Cuba, and thinks that Zhao must have brought it here to Iceland, but Bond thinks that that would have been impossible, and he deduces that someone must have had a gene therapy clinic already installed in Gustav Graves' ice palace, and therefore it must have been Gustav Graves who is undergoing the gene alteration process. And from here, Bond is able to make the mental leap that Gustav Graves must be Colonel Moon. So that is some brilliant deductive reasoning. He goes to Gustav Graves' office to confront him and says,
"So you live to die another day."
And I have so many questions here, because I can easily see that Colonel Moon survived that hovercraft crash. I can also buy that Colonel Moon snuck out of North Korea and made it to the gene alteration lab in Cuba. And I can even allow my mind to believe that the gene alteration process is so convincing that it convincingly turns Colonel Townsend Moon into the Caucasian man, Gustav Graves. But what I struggle to accept is the fact that Gustav Graves came out of nowhere and with less than 15 months became a well-known celebrity billionaire without the British government, including MI6, right? MI6 having any clue from where he came from. We only learn that he was an Argentinian orphan who worked in the diamond mines before he discovered his own diamond mine in Iceland and became rich. So I guess the idea is that Dr. Alvarez kidnaps orphans, uses their DNA for the genetic alteration, and he kidnapped an Argentinian orphan named Gustav Graves, killed him, and took over his DNA. But Colonel Moon also took over his identity. I guess we have to believe that because it's the only one that even begins to make sense. Colonel Moon then took the conflict diamonds he got from the arms dealer and pretended to have found them in Iceland, all under the nose of the British Secret Service. Well, I am struggling, but I guess I can suspend my disbelief for this movie because I am having a good time. Remember, when making Dr. No, director Terrence Young had the plan to keep the action and the editing so fast that the audience will be having so much fun that they didn't notice the flaws in the story. And there's definitely an element of that here. So Graves, aka Colonel Moon, tells Bond that he based the character of Gustav Graves on him and his unearned swagger, and has been enjoying toying with him and the fact that Bond had no idea who he was. Well, Bond has the drop on Gustav Graves, and Miranda Frost comes in and initially points the gun at Graves, but then changes and points her gun at Bond. Bond reluctantly tries to shoot her, but his gun is empty. Remember, Frost took out the bullets from his gun when Bond put his gun underneath her pillow. So Bond is caught, Zhao and his men have been surrounded, and they're about to kill him, but he uses his sonic ring to shatter the glass floor and repels to the roof of the ice castle and makes a daring escape. Bond gets in Graves' ice dragster, and the second we see this dragster, we know what's coming. Meanwhile, Jinx gets herself captured again, while Gustav Graves is demonstrating the capabilities of his satellite laser to 3 North Koreans, showing them that this laser can deliver more than sunlight for agriculture, but can also be used as a destructive weapon. And this satellite laser is an obvious homage to Blofeld's own satellite laser in Diamonds Are Forever. And these 3 North Koreans are his hardliners in the North Korean government, who at the end of the movie will arrest General Moon and bring him to Graves. And Graves uses the laser to chase after Bond, who goes over a cliff and hangs off while the laser melts the wall of ice. And then Bond grabs a parachute, and here we are. And every time I watch it, I hope that it doesn't look too ridiculous as I remember. I do feel it just gets funnier and more ridiculous every time I see it. I can't help but let out a little involuntary laugh every time I see it. I think it's a combination of the dated CGI that makes it look like a cartoon, and poor Pierce Brosnan is absolutely doing his best to sell the scene. And then you add that earnest action music, and you get the feeling that the crew were very proud of the scene, and they thought they were totally nailing it. And I think the only way they really could have gotten away with doing the scene is if they really did it practically as a real stunt. Now, the paragliding wouldn't have been too difficult of a stunt to perform, but the scene would have been very difficult to film because you have to catch a huge tsunami to surf, and that would have been very difficult to find. And besides, I think the fact that the stunt was done with CGI was kind of the point, because this was 2001, the dawn of CGI. And when you see the production crew and the directors talk about this stunt, you really see them marvel at the fact that they could do this stunt in a 3-dimensional, computer-created virtual world. And they were really excited at what this meant for the future of cinema.
I think some of the stuff we're doing in this, in terms of the big stunt effect sequences, the high-end action sequences that are done for real are still going to exist, but I think that it's going to be half of them will exist for real and half of them will be augmented with. And sometimes they may move into entirely digital special effects that way.
Well, 24 years later, we know exactly what it meant for cinema, because not only would CGI improve so that it no longer looked as cartoonishly as it does here, it would completely take over Hollywood to the point that filmmakers really learned that the best use of CGI was one used really with restraint. Bond takes over a snowmobile, and I wonder if this is a reference to the opening teaser of A View to a Kill. And then he heads back to the ice fortress. He gets in his invisible car, and I thought it was a nice touch to add CGI tire tracks where the invisible car drives. But by some bad luck, a second snowmobile plows into Bond's car, alerting Zhao of its location. And Zhao himself has his own gadget supercar, a heavily modified green Jaguar XKR that has a machine gun, has missiles, and even has a battering ram. The two cars fight on the ice, and this is a really worthy car battle. And it's great. Zhao hits Bond's car with a missile, which flips his car over, but Bond cleverly uses his car's ejector seat to flip himself back. It's a fun action sequence, and one of the better car battles in the history of the franchise. Graves then decides to use his laser to melt his entire ice fortress, and Bond drives his car inside the ice fortress with Zhao in hot pursuit. And the two fight and wreak havoc inside the melting ice fortress while Jinx is desperately trying to escape and stay alive as the ice turns into water all around her. Zhao has the upper hand on Bond and is about to crash into Bond with his battering ram, but at the last second, Bond tricks Zhao by engaging his camouflage and driving up a ramp, which freaks out Zhao, who crashes his car into the water pool. And when Zhao swims out of the car and is about to get out of the water, Bond shoots and drops a chandelier on him, killing him. Jinx has drowned, but Bond grabs her and gets her inside a warm vat of water and saves her life, as they see Graves get away in a cargo plane. And here we get to the fourth and final chapter, where the heads of MI6 and the heads of NSA are meeting on the South Korean side of the demilitarized zone. And we get an interesting bit of casting. We get Michael Madsen, who plays Jinx's boss, Damien Falco, the head of the NSA. And he's a pretty big star for such a minor role, and it makes me wonder if they were already setting up the elements to pitch a Jinx solo series. Bond and Jinx sneak into North Korea by first riding these Switchblade wing jets and then parachuting into North Korea. And meanwhile, the US launches a missile at Graves' satellite, which he easily destroys. They sneak aboard Graves' AN-124 cargo plane, and Graves gets into his robotic power suit. Yes, just when you think the filmmakers couldn't take this movie to another level, the villain shows up in a robotic power suit. And the way he's introduced when he turns around, you think the director must have thought this must have looked really cool, but it really doesn't. I mean, it looks like a much less cooler version of RoboCop or like a discount Power Ranger in the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers franchise. Here, the three North Korean hardliners who we met earlier at the Ice Fortress bring General Moon to the plane to meet his son, but of course he can't recognize him. And he wonders what his son did to himself and at what cost. And it's a pretty emotionally effective scene. Gustav Graves, or rather Colonel Tan Sun Moon, reveals his master plan, which is to use the satellite to destroy all the mines in the demilitarized zone, leading a clear path for the North Korean army to march into South Korea. I really wonder if he's really thought his plan out. I don't think the demilitarized zone is what's preventing North Korea from waging war against the South Koreans. But it's a movie, so I'll go with the logic. And, of course, Colonel Moon is insane. General Moon, who probably has a better grasp of the sensitive international politics and diplomacy of the region, probably understands that it's a bad idea and is against it. General Moon tries to stop his son, but Graves electrocutes him with his power glove and kills him. Jinx commandeers a cargo plane, and Bond accidentally shoots the window, which causes people to get sucked out of the plane, a reference to the ending of Goldfinger. Bond confronts Gustav Graves, while Miranda Frost confronts Jinx, and Jinx flies the plane into the path of the laser, and Jinx kills Frost by stabbing her with a sword that has the art of war embedded into it. And Graves uses his power glove to electrocute Bond and is about to parachute to safety, leaving Bond to crash in the cargo plane. Bond opens Graves' parachute, leading him to be sucked into the plane's engines. And this apparently causes the laser to shut down. Apparently, Gustav was controlling the laser through his power suit, so when he and the suit were destroyed, it effectively caused the connection to the satellite to be severed, causing deactivation of the laser. As the cargo plane falls apart in midair, Jinx and Bond are able to get to the back of the cargo plane and inside a helicopter, barely escaping as everything falls out of the back of the cargo plane, a possible reference to the cargo plane scene in The Living Daylights. Bond and Jinx barely escape from crashing the helicopter and fly away to safety along with all of Gustav Graves' diamonds. And then we're back at MI6 and we see Moneypenny seducing James Bond. And then suddenly Q comes in and we realize that this was a virtual simulation using Q's virtual reality glasses. And it was really funny at the time, and I think it would have worked better if there were more Pierce Brosnan and James Bond movies with Moneypenny. However, this will be Samantha Bond's last scene as Moneypenny, and a small part of fandom feels she deserved a little better, because I thought she was awesome as Moneypenny, and she and Pierce Brosnan had an amazing chemistry, harkening back to the days of Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell. The movie ends with Bond and Jinx enjoying themselves in a Buddhist temple with a crazy amount of diamonds, and thus ends one of the craziest, most over-the-top James Bond film in the history of the franchise. This movie was made on a budget of $142 million, making it the single most expensive James Bond movie to date. Remember, in the 80s, the Bond films were being made for around $30 million, and GoldenEye, which was made only 8 years earlier, had a budget of $60 million. Die Another Day cost $142 million, but once again, much of the budget was offset by product placement. Over 70 companies paid to have their products in this movie, and while Eon claims they only brought in $70 million, analysts have claimed that they made over $100 million, with some estimates going as high as $120 million, significantly offsetting the huge budget. The product placement was so egregious that many have jokingly called this movie Buy Another Day. The deals included Aston Martin V12 Vanquish, Jaguar XKR, and other Ford models. Other product placement deals included ST DuPont cufflinks, Bollinger Champagne, and Heineken beer. And of course, this film includes the Philips Norelco shavers that Bond uses to shave off his beard, as well as clothing brands like Brioni for Bond's tuxedo, and a Turnbull and Astor white shirt and necktie that Bond lays out on his bed in Hong Kong, and the floral shirts Bond wears in Cuba was Brioni, along with his tan suit, and his shoes are Church's. Revlon created the 007 color collection that matched Jinx's makeup and colors of her outfits. And other brands included Omega, Walther, 7-Up, Sony, Visa, Circuit City, and many, many more. And the Broccoli family realized that they may have gone a little too far in the product placement and decided to roll back the product placement and use less brands for their next Bond films. The movie premiered on November 18, 2002 at the Royal Albert Hall in London, and the movie was the #1 film on opening weekend. The movie competed with Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and the two would battle for the top spot at the box office, where Harry Potter would win one week and then James Bond would win the other. It was actually kind of cool. In the end, Die Another Day earned $160.9 million in the US and Canada and $432 million worldwide, becoming the 6th highest grossing film of 2002. And it was the highest grossing box office for any Bond film up to that time, when unadjusted for inflation. Now remember, adjusted for inflation, it was still Thunderball. And it may be hard to believe, but this film got positive reviews at the time. It had an A- cinema score, and most of the top critics gave it a positive review. I remember this. All the reviews I read at the time were all positive. Legendary film critic Roger Ebert gave the film 3 out of 4 stars at the time and gave it a thumbs up. Michael Lucchina of Film Threat praised the film as the best of the series to star Pierce Brosnan and called it the most satisfying installment of the franchise in recent memory. Yes, that was the consensus at the time. Larry Carroll of Countdown.com praised Lee Tamohori for having magnificently balanced the film so that it keeps true to the Bond legend, and praised the references to the classic films that preceded it. Entertainment Weekly magazine also gave it a positive review, saying that Tamohori, a true filmmaker, had reestablished the pop sensuality of the Bond franchise. Now, meanwhile, there were critics who criticized the over-the-top nature of the film, and Roger Moore himself hated the film, and he said, "I thought it just went too far, and that's coming from me, the first Bond in space. Invisible cars and dodgy CGI footage? Please." So, Roger Moore, that is pretty cold-blooded. Also at the time of this movie, the role of Jinx by Halle Berry was also very popular, and Eon was very close to making a separate Jinx solo film as a Bond spin-off series, and they had a script, and they even hired director Stephen Frears, who directed Dangerous Liaisons, The Grifters, and High Fidelity, and they were ready to shoot this. However, right around this time, around 2003, some movies like Charlie's Angels 2, Full Throttle, as well as Lara Croft Tomb Raider 2, The Cradle of Life came out, and they were both failures. And Jinx would have been very similar to these two movies. So the producers decided to pull the plug. Unfortunately, Halle Berry was very disappointed, and she's gone on to say that she liked the role of Jinx so much that if producers ever wanted her to return for a cameo in a James Bond movie, she would do the role for absolutely for free. And I think that is pretty cool. Well, today, time has not been kind to this movie. And unfortunately, it is considered by many to be the worst entry in the James Bond canon, and it often occupies a low rank on the Bond-related lists. And in 2021, Yahoo survey consisting of 22 experts and superfans, the ranking that listed GoldenEye as #1 and Casino Royale as #2, listed Die Another Day as ranked 3rd worst installment after Quantum of Solace and Spectre. And it appears that even Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson worried that they'd gone a little too far with Die Another Day, sort of seeing this as their Moonraker, and felt that they should reel in their next film into a more grounded James Bond movie. And they were fully committed to making that movie with Pierce Brosnan. Because in 2002, this was a very successful film, and they were 100% ready to make a fifth Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie, and it was kind of a given. Pierce Brosnan had a 4-film contract to play James Bond, which he signed for GoldenEye in 1995. Brosnan had made $4 million for GoldenEye. He made $8.2 million for Tomorrow Never Dies. Then he made $12.4 million for The World Is Not Enough. And finally, for Die Another Day, he made $16.5 million. So Pierce Brosnan and Eon were negotiating his salary for a fifth James Bond movie, probably on a film-by-film basis. And the magic number that was being discussed was $30 million for his fifth James Bond movie. However, corporate intrigue and business shenanigans struck again, leading to a crazy situation where MGM and Eon Films would get to own the rights to the first James Bond novel, Casino Royale. Remember, Ian Fleming had sold the rights to the first novel, and so it was never available for Eon to make a movie adaptation about it. This is also why a competing company was able to make the Casino Royale comedy in 1967, and this had always been a point of contention for Eon Films. But finally, they had the rights to Casino Royale, and this was going to be their next movie. So they decided to reboot the entire franchise, leading Eon to go in a whole new direction without Pierce Brosnan. And so we enter the Daniel Craig era. And in my next video, I'm going to talk about the events that led to MGM and Eon acquiring the rights to Casino Royale, as we talk about arguably the greatest James Bond film of all time, along with Daniel Craig's debut film in the 2006 Casino Royale. Well, that ends my video on Die Another Day. If you've enjoyed this video, check out my other videos in the feed, including other James Bond movies, the Star Trek franchise, the Star Wars franchise, comedies like Popeye and Airplane, and a whole bunch more. That ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.